There is a place in the American Southwest where the walls of a canyon speak, not metaphorically, not in the way poets describe wind and stone exchanging whispers. The walls of this canyon are covered in symbols, in hands, in spirals, in animals, in figures that seem to float rather than stand, and when the sun hits them at exactly the right angle on exactly the right day of the year, the light falls through a crack in the rock and strikes the center of a carved spiral with a precision that no accident could explain. Researchers who witnessed it for the first time in the 1970s stood in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. One of them said it felt like receiving a message. Another said it felt like being watched. The third said nothing at all and just started writing in her notebook. That site is called Fajada Butte, and it sits in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and it is one of dozens of locations across this continent where scientists, archaeologists, engineers, and geologists have gone in expecting to find the remnants of a primitive culture, and instead found something that did not fit the categories they brought with them, something that made them revise their assumptions, rewrite their reports, and in some cases spend the rest of their careers trying to explain what they had seen. This is a story about those places, not just one or two of them, but a whole map of them, spread across North America, from the deserts of the Southwest to the mounds of the Midwest, to the shorelines of the Great Lakes, to the forests of the Northeast, each one holding a piece of something much larger than itself, each one suggesting that the story of humanity on this continent is older, more complex, and more sophisticated than anything that ended up in the history books we grew up with. And the reason these places are now shocking scientists is not because someone suddenly discovered them. Most of them have been known for decades, some for over a century. What is shocking the scientific world right now is the convergence. The moment when researchers, in different fields, working independently, they started comparing notes and realizing that what they were each looking at in isolation made a completely different kind of sense when placed alongside all the others. The calendars matched. The alignments pointed at the same stars. The trade goods appeared in places that should have been unreachable. The DNA told stories the maps had erased. And underneath some of these sites, ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging began revealing structures that no one had seen coming, because no one had thought to look in that particular way, in that particular place, until now. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The story starts, as so many American stories do, with the assumption that it starts somewhere else. The dominant narrative of pre-Columbian North America has always been built around a kind of ceiling, a maximum level of complexity that indigenous cultures were assumed to have reached before contact with Europe. Sophisticated in many ways, yes. Artistically rich, yes. Spiritually elaborate, yes. But limited, confined to their regions, without writing in any recognizable form, without large-scale coordinated infrastructure, without the kind of long-distance organized communication that could produce synchronized astronomical knowledge across thousands of miles. That ceiling is cracking. It has been cracking for decades, actually, but the cracks are now wide enough that even mainstream institutions are starting to talk about what is on the other side. And what is on the other side is a continent that was not a collection of isolated cultures bumping into each other by chance. It was a networked world, a world with roads, with trade routes that spanned from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Shield, with ceremonial centers that functioned as hubs of knowledge as much as hubs of goods, with astronomical traditions so precise that the structures encoding them still align with celestial events to within fractions of a degree after more than 1,000 years of earthquakes, erosion, and time. Chaco Canyon is usually where this conversation begins, and there is a reason for that. The place is simply too big and too precise to be dismissed. The canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a landscape so dry and so remote that most modern visitors find it difficult to imagine why anyone would choose to build anything here at all, let alone the largest pre-Columbian structures north of Mexico. And yet that is exactly what happened. Beginning around 850 years of the Common Era and continuing for roughly 300 years, the people who occupied this canyon built what can only be described as an architectural system of a scale and intentionality that researchers are still working to fully comprehend. The largest of the great houses, as archaeologists call them, is Pueblo Bonito. It is a D-shaped structure covering more than 2 acres of ground floor, rising in places to 5 stories, containing somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms. The walls are built from precisely shaped and fitted sandstone, with a core and veneer technique so structurally sophisticated that modern engineers have expressed admiration for the way it distributes load across the past. Building. The walls are aligned, not approximately aligned, not generally oriented in a cardinal direction. Aligned to within fractions of a degree with true north, true south, true east, and true west, at a time and in a place where there were no compasses and no surveying instruments in the European sense of those terms, and yet the alignment is there. Researchers have measured it repeatedly. The eastern wall of Pueblo Bonito runs almost perfectly north to south. The interior is organized around solar and lunar events. On the winter solstice, the rising sun enters through specific doorways and illuminates specific rooms in a sequence that is clearly not accidental. On the summer solstice, different alignments activate. During the standstill of the lunar cycle, which occurs once every 18.5 years when the moon reaches its most extreme rising and setting positions on the horizon, the great houses of Chaco align with the moonrise and moonset in ways that can only have been planned across generations of careful observation. Think about what that last point means. To encode the 18.5-year lunar standstill into architecture, you need to observe it at least once, probably twice, to confirm the pattern. That is a minimum of 18.5 years of continuous sky watching before you even begin construction. Then you need to communicate those measurements to the people doing the building with enough precision that the walls end up within fractions of a degree of where they need to be. And then you need to transmit the knowledge of what these alignments mean to the generations who will come after you, because the next lunar standstill will not occur for another 18.5 years, and the generation that sees it may have no living memory of the last one. This is not the behavior of a people who are responding to their immediate environment in improvised ways. This is the behavior of a civilization with a long memory, a formalized knowledge system, and the kind of institutional continuity that allows precision to survive across lifetimes. What makes Chaco even more remarkable is what surrounds it. The great houses are not isolated structures. They are nodes in a network. Radiating outward from the canyon in multiple directions are roads, not paths, not trails worn by repeated walking. Roads, engineered roads, some of them 30 feet wide, cut straight through the desert with a determination that ignores all the natural features of the landscape. Where a hill stands in the way, the road goes over it in a straight line, with carved staircases ascending and descending the slope. Where a wash crosses the route, the road continues on the other side at exactly the same heading. These roads extend for hundreds of miles in some directions. Aerial photography in the 1960s and 70s began revealing them as pale lines, visible from above, that were nearly invisible at ground level. Satellite imaging has since extended the known network considerably, and the roads connect things. They connect outlier communities, dozens of smaller great house complexes built in the Chacoan architectural style, to the canyon itself. Some of these outliers are 150 miles from Chaco, some are further. They contain the same architectural signatures, the same core and veneer wall construction, the same astronomical alignments, the same distinctive black-on-white pottery that is among the most precisely made ceramic work in North American prehistory. They imported their turquoise from mines in Colorado and Nevada. They imported macaws from central Mexico. They imported marine shells from the Pacific coast and from the Gulf of Mexico. The network was not regional, it was continental. Researchers who study the Chacoan system now describe it as a regional integrative system, meaning a mechanism through which large numbers of people spread across a vast geographic area were connected to a central place by shared ritual, shared architectural language, shared astronomical knowledge, and shared material culture. The question that has not been fully answered is why? What was Chaco for? What was the engine that kept this network running for 300 years? One of the most compelling arguments, and one that has gained significant traction in the last 2 decades of research, is that Chaco was primarily a ceremonial and astronomical center. A place where knowledge was maintained, where calendrical precision was the highest form of social technology, and where the ability to predict celestial events conferred authority and coordinating power over a population spread across thousands of square miles. The people came to Chaco not to live there permanently in large numbers, though some did, but to participate in ceremonies timed to astronomical events, to bring goods, to receive knowledge, and to carry it back to their communities across the network. This model explains something that has always puzzled researchers about Chaco. The population the canyon could actually support in terms of local food production is far smaller than the number of people the architecture was built to accommodate. The great houses have far more rooms than they could ever have housed full-time residents. The explanation that has emerged is that many of the rooms were not residential. They were storage facilities for goods brought to the canyon from across the network. And the great kivas, the enormous circular underground ceremonial chambers at Chaco, some of them over 60 feet in diameter, could hold hundreds of people at a time, suggesting gatherings of a size that the local permanent population could never have produced on its own. Chaco was a destination, a place where the calendar was kept, where the sky was red, where the network was renewed. And when it ended, when the system collapsed sometime in the 12th century after a decades-long drought that appears in the tree ring record with devastating clarity, the knowledge did not simply disappear. The descendants of the Chacoan people carried it with them into the pueblos of the Rio Grande Valley and the mesotop communities of Arizona and Utah, where their successors still live. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest today, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the people of the many Rio Grande pueblos, maintain ceremonial calendars and astronomical knowledge that connect directly to what was being practiced at Chaco 1,000 years ago. When researchers have asked Pueblo elders about the great houses of Chaco, the response has rarely been puzzlement. It has been recognition. But Chaco is only the beginning of what researchers have found, and only one corner of a continent that turns out to be covered in sites that defy the story that was told about them for most of the last 2 centuries. Move east from the desert. Cross the continental divide. Follow the rivers down from the mountains and into the vast interior plains. Keep going east until you reach the river valleys of the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Illinois, and the Tennessee, and you will find yourself in the presence of earthworks. Not the small burial mounds that most people have some vague awareness of. Earthworks, on a scale that, when researchers finally began surveying them with modern technology, produced a reaction in scientific publications that was remarkably close to disbelief. Newark, Ohio, is a mid-sized American city. It has a downtown, a highway system, a Walmart, a high school with a football team, and a golf course. The golf course, as it happens, is built on top of one of the most extraordinary surviving monuments in the entire Western Hemisphere. The octagon earthworks at Newark, Ohio, are exactly what the name suggests. An octagon, an 8-sided geometric enclosure whose walls are made of earth, whose dimensions are so precise that surveyors who have measured them repeatedly have confirmed that the angles of the octagon are accurate to within a fraction of a degree of true geometric regularity. Connected to the octagon by a set of parallel earthen walls is a perfect circle, also precisely surveyed. The circle's diameter is exactly the right size to fit inside the octagon in a specific geometric relationship that researchers are still working to fully characterize. And then, there is the alignment. The octagon at Newark is oriented so that its primary axis, the long diagonal that runs through the center of the structure, points precisely toward the moonrise at the northern extreme of the lunar standstill, the same 18.5-year cycle that the great houses of Chaco encode in their walls, the same astronomical event, a continent away, in a completely different cultural tradition. In earthworks built by a people called the Hopewell, who flourished in the Ohio Valley between roughly 100 and 500 years of the Common Era, centuries before Chaco even began. When researchers first confirmed the Newark octagon's lunar alignment in the 1980s, it did not immediately become front-page news. It should have. The implication is staggering. 2 completely separate cultural traditions, separated by nearly 1,000 miles and by several centuries in time, were both encoding the same rare astronomical event into their most elaborate ceremonial architecture. Either there was a connection between them, some thread of knowledge transmission that crossed the continent, or 2 independent civilizations both chose to focus their highest architectural ambitions on the same 18.5-year cycle of the moon. Neither explanation is comfortable for the old story of pre-Columbian North America. The first explanation requires acknowledging that the continent was far more interconnected than the textbooks suggested. The second requires acknowledging that the astronomical sophistication of these cultures was not primitive or local, but was a sophisticated science capable of developing independently in multiple places, which means it was a deep and enduring intellectual tradition rather than an accident or an anomaly. The Newark earthworks were not alone. They were part of a network of geometric enclosures spread across the Ohio Valley and beyond, connected by what researchers now call the Hopewell interaction sphere, a web of exchange and influence that distributed specific artifact types, specific ceremonial practices, and specific artistic styles across an enormous geographic area. Hopewell-style objects have been found from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. A copper headdress found in an Ohio burial mound was made from copper mined in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. A set of shark teeth, found in the same burial complex, came from the ocean 1,000 miles away. Obsidian tools were traced to sources in Yellowstone. The Hopewell people were not wandering. They were connected. Something was moving across the continent in an organized way, something that went far beyond simple trade in the sense of adjacent communities exchanging goods. The specific combination of artifacts found in Hopewell burial contexts, copper, mica, obsidian, marine shells, bare teeth, certain ceramic styles, appears across the entire network with a consistency that suggests not casual exchange, but participation in a shared ceremonial system. The goods were not random, they were ritual, and the ritual was the same from Ohio to Louisiana, from Missouri to Ontario. What was the Hopewell interaction sphere? What organized it? How did a network of this geographic extent maintain coherent ceremonial traditions across communities that had no writing, no wheeled transport, no metal tools in the modern sense? These are the questions that researchers are still working on, and the answers that are emerging are consistently more sophisticated and more surprising than the questions originally anticipated. The earthworks themselves, when surveyed with modern aerial and satellite technology, reveal levels of geometric precision that were simply not apparent to ground-level observers in earlier centuries. The circles are true circles, the squares are true squares, the parallel walls are parallel to within margins of error that a modern surveyor would consider acceptable. At a site called High Bank Works in Ohio, a circle and an octagon are joined in the same configuration as at Newark, and the two sites are aligned with each other, across a distance of 60 miles, by a sightline that points to the same lunar standstill. This is not coincidence. Someone was planning these structures across the landscape with a coordination and a geometric precision that requires either a very sophisticated oral tradition of astronomical and mathematical knowledge, or some form of recording system that we have not yet recognized as such, or both. Move south from Ohio. Follow the great rivers down toward the Gulf. Watch the landscape change from wooded hills to vast floodplains, where the Mississippi and Missouri and Ohio rivers come together in a confluence that is one of the most productive natural environments in North America. In the river bottoms, where the soil is deep and rich, and the floods that periodically cover everything also continuously renew the fertility of the ground, something grew, something so large that when the first European-American settlers encountered it in the early 19th century, they did not have a conceptual framework for what they were looking at. Some of them decided it must have been built by a lost race of giants. Others proposed the Egyptians, or a wandering tribe of Israelites, or any number of other explanations that placed the builders somewhere outside of North America, because the idea that the indigenous people of this continent had built cities of this scale was, for those observers, simply not available as a thought. What they were looking at was Cahokia, and what Cahokia was, at its peak, was the largest city in North America, north of Mexico. At its height, somewhere between 900 and 1100 years of the Common Era, the Greater Cahokia metropolitan area covered an area of roughly 6 square miles and supported a population that modern estimates place between 10 and 20,000 people, which made it larger at the time than London. The central feature of the site is a structure called Monk's Mound, named not for any connection to indigenous religion, but for a group of French Trappist monks who farmed on it in the early 19th century. before anyone understood what they were farming on top of. Monk's Mound is a platform mound built entirely of earth. It covers 14 acres of ground at its base. It rises in terraced stages to a height of 100 feet. The volume of earth moved to construct it exceeds that of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Let that settle for a moment. The largest prehistoric earthwork in North America, built by indigenous people in what is now Illinois, contains more fill material than the largest stone pyramid ever constructed in ancient Egypt. Monk's Mound was built in stages, with different platforms added over centuries, and it served as the foundation for a large building at its summit, a building that researchers believe was the residence or ceremonial space of Cahokia's ruling elite. Around it spread a planned city. Plazas, other mounds arranged in specific geometric relationships, a wooden palisade wall surrounding the central precinct that was rebuilt at least 4 times over the course of Cahokia's occupation, suggesting both the resources to maintain a large construction workforce and an ongoing concern with defining and protecting the central sacred space. And then there is Woodhenge, or rather, the multiple Woodhenges, because researchers have found evidence of at least 5 of them at Cahokia, each one a circle of large wooden posts erected and later replaced with a new circle in slightly different configuration. The name comes from the obvious comparison to Stonehenge in Britain, and the comparison is not merely visual. The post circles at Cahokia were, like their British counterpart, astronomical instruments. The posts were positioned so that from a specific observation point at the center of each circle, the sunrise on the equinoxes and solstices could be watched as it appeared directly behind a particular post on the horizon. The circles were calendars, precise, observable, publicly usable calendars that allowed the people of Cahokia to track the solar year with a degree of accuracy sufficient for regulating agricultural cycles, ceremonial timing, and whatever political and economic functions were organized around the calendar. Cahokia's collapse, which happened sometime in the 13th century, remains one of the most discussed and least understood events in North American prehistory. The city that had been home to tens of thousands of people was essentially abandoned. People left. They went somewhere, dispersed into smaller communities across the region, but the concentration of population and power that had existed at Cahokia dissolved, and it did so in a relatively short period of time. The debates about why center on several possibilities: drought, environmental degradation from clearing forests and intensive agriculture, political instability, epidemic disease, some combination of all of these. The tree ring record shows a climate anomaly in the 13th century that affected the entire American Midwest. But researchers have also found evidence of internal stress at Cahokia before the environmental deterioration, suggesting that whatever ended the city was not simply a matter of the weather turning bad. What researchers have found beneath Cahokia in recent years, through ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR imaging, has added layers to the story that were not visible before. There are buried structures, features that show up in remote sensing but have not yet been excavated, that suggest the city's layout was more planned and more extensive than even the visible mounds indicate. There are traces of neighborhoods, of what appear to be residential districts, organized around smaller central plazas, of features that suggest Cahokia had an urban structure in a real sense, not just a ceremonial center surrounded by scattered habitation, but something more integrated and more deliberately organized. There is also the question of the suburb. Cahokia was not alone. Surrounding the main site within a radius of several miles were a series of smaller mound centers, each with its own plaza, its own residential area, its own organizational structure. Researchers now describe these as satellite communities of the Cahokia political system, smaller nodes in a hierarchy that had Monk's Mound at its apex. Beyond the satellite communities, Cahokian influence extended across a much larger region. The distinctive ceramic style associated with Cahokia, a shell-tempered pottery with specific vessel forms and surface treatments, appears at sites hundreds of miles from the city in all directions. Cahokian-style mound complexes were built across the American Southeast and the Midwest. Something was radiating outward from that city in the river bottoms of Illinois, and it was changing communities at distances that should have made direct influence difficult to sustain. The question of how Cahokia organized its influence over such a large area is one that researchers are still working through. The evidence suggests a combination of mechanisms: the movement of people, the distribution of goods, the adoption of ritual practices, and possibly the spread of a belief system that gave Cahokia's central authority a sacred legitimacy that extended beyond the reach of any army or trading expedition. The symbolism that appears at Cahokia, the specific combination of imagery involving the sun, birds of prey, human sacrifice, and cosmological duality, appears across the American Southeast and Midwest in what researchers call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a shared symbolic vocabulary that connected communities from Florida to Nebraska to the Gulf Coast in a web of shared meaning that lasted for centuries. This is not what the history books described. The history books described a collection of tribes. What the archaeology describes is something more like a civilization, distributed across the landscape in a way that did not produce the kind of dense urban core that European history associated with the concept, but that nonetheless had the coordination, the communication, the shared institutional structure, and the cultural coherence that the word civilization is supposed to indicate. Now go north, leave the river bottomlands, head toward the Great Lakes, enter the territory where, sometime around 5,000 years ago, something extraordinary began to happen with copper. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan sits on top of one of the richest deposits of native copper on the surface of the Earth. Native copper means copper in its metallic form, not locked inside ore that needs smelting, but ready to be worked by hammering and annealing directly. The Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale in Lake Superior contain copper deposits so extensive and so accessible that they have been mined in the modern era as commercial operations. But the modern mining operations were not the first. When 19th century miners opened their first shafts, they found ancient pits, ancient tools, ancient timbers. The evidence of a mining operation so extensive that serious researchers estimated it had removed between 500 million and 1 billion pounds of copper from the ground over a period of roughly 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Think about that timeline. Beginning approximately 5,000 years ago and continuing for 3 millennia, people were systematically extracting enormous quantities of copper from the shores of Lake Superior. They heated the rock with fire, cracked it with cold water, hammered the copper free with stone mauls, lifted it out of the pits in birch bark containers, and carried it away. Then, around 3,000 years ago, it stopped. The copper mining of the Upper Peninsula simply ceased. The pits were left, the tools were abandoned, and then the copper, the physical copper that had been removed from the ground, largely disappeared from the archaeological record in the Great Lakes region. But it reappeared somewhere else. Copper artifacts in the Hopewell burial mounds of Ohio, made from Lake Superior copper, appear in quantities that suggest the upper Midwest was awash in the material during the Hopewell period. Before that, during an earlier cultural period that researchers call the Old Copper Complex, the copper was being used to make tools, weapons, and ornaments at a technological level that represented one of the earliest examples of systematic metalworking anywhere in the world. Tools from the Old Copper Complex have been found across an enormous geographic area, from the Great Lakes to the southeast, suggesting the same kind of wide distribution network that the Hopewell material would later exhibit. And then there is the mystery that has never been satisfactorily resolved. Where did all the copper go? 500 million to 1 billion pounds extracted over 3,000 years. The quantities found in the archaeological record in North America account for only a tiny fraction of that total. Researchers who have grappled with this question have proposed various explanations: that most of it corroded and returned to the earth over the millennia, that it was recycled and reworked so many times that its original mining context was lost, that some of it moved into trade networks whose endpoints we haven't yet located. None of these explanations fully satisfies, and the question sits at the center of one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of pre-Columbian North American archaeology. What is known is that the copper was there, it was being extracted in quantities that dwarf anything else in North American prehistory, and it was moving. The network that moved it overlapped with the networks that moved obsidian from Yellowstone, marine shells from the Gulf and the Pacific, mica from the Appalachians, exotic ceramics from across the continent, and now, in the last decade, LiDAR and satellite imagery are beginning to reveal the physical infrastructure of those networks in ways that were simply not visible before. Roads in places where no roads were supposed to exist, causeways across wetlands, embankments marking routes through forests. The material traces of a connectivity that people have been arguing about for decades, but could not fully see until the technology to see it became available. The LiDAR revolution in archaeology has been nothing short of transformative. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it works by sending pulses of laser light from an aircraft toward the ground and measuring the time it takes for the pulses to return. By doing this millions of times per second across a survey area, it is possible to create a three-dimensional map of the ground surface that strips away the vegetation cover and reveals the topography beneath it with extraordinary detail. In a landscape covered by forest, which much of the American interior is, LiDAR can see through the canopy and map features that are completely invisible to ground-level observation and to conventional aerial photography. When researchers began applying LiDAR to areas of North America that were known to contain ancient sites, the results were, to use a term that appears repeatedly in the scientific literature, surprising. Features that had been dismissed as natural landforms were revealed as engineered earthworks. Sites that had appeared isolated turned out to be connected to extensive networks of earthen features. The known footprints of well-studied sites expanded dramatically when LiDAR showed what was hiding under the surrounding forest. At a site in Louisiana called Poverty Point, which dates to roughly 3,500 years ago and was already known as one of the most remarkable early complex sites in North America, LiDAR revealed additional earthworks extending the site's layout in directions that ground-level survey had not detected. Poverty Point itself is extraordinary by any measure. It is a series of concentric earthen ridges, originally 6 of them arranged in an arc centered on a central plaza, covering an area of roughly 400 acres. The ridges were residential, built up over time by the accumulation of habitation debris and intentional earth moving, and people lived on them in large numbers for what appears to have been a permanent community. At the center, on the flat plaza, were larger mound features. To the west, a massive mound that recent dating has placed among the oldest large-scale earthen constructions in North America. And around the site, a landscape full of evidence that people were coming to Poverty Point from hundreds of miles away, bringing raw materials, exchanging goods, participating in a system of interaction that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico to the Appalachians. Poverty Point is old, 3,500 years old. That is older than the Roman Republic. It is older than classical Greece. It is roughly contemporary with the later period of ancient Egypt, the Egypt of Ramesses II and Tutankhamun. And it is in Louisiana, built by indigenous people in North America, at a time when the textbook account of this continent described scattered bands of hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlements and no large-scale social organization. The textbook was wrong. Poverty Point existed. It was large, complex, permanently occupied, and connected to a continent-spanning network of exchange. And it was doing all of this at least 1,000 years before the Hopewell mound builders of Ohio, who were doing similar things in their own time and region. The depth of the timeline is one of the most unsettling things about what the science is now revealing. The complexity, the organization, the geographic connectivity, the astronomical sophistication, none of it appeared suddenly in the centuries just before European contact. It had been developing for thousands of years. The Cahokia of 900 years ago was not an unprecedented anomaly. It was the latest expression of a tradition of large-scale, organized society that had roots reaching back to Poverty Point and before. The Newark earthworks of 2,000 years ago were not an isolated curiosity. They were part of a tradition of geometric precision and astronomical encoding that can be traced both backward and forward in time, to earlier earthwork traditions in the same region, and to the later Mississippian ceremonial centers that would eventually include Cahokia. Connecting these dots across time and space requires a different way of thinking about pre-Columbian North America than the one that most people were taught. It requires thinking about the continent not as a landscape of isolated and static cultures, but as a world in which complex societies rose, flourished, collapsed, and gave rise to successor cultures that inherited and adapted their knowledge, their practices, and sometimes their physical infrastructure. A world in which the movement of people, ideas, goods, and beliefs across continental distances was not an occasional exception, but a regular and fundamental feature of social life. Some of the most striking evidence for this continental-scale connectivity comes from the study of ancient DNA. Over the last 15 years, the technology of ancient DNA analysis has advanced to the point where researchers can extract genetic information from human remains, thousands of years old, and use it to trace population movements, relationships, and interactions with a specificity that no other method can match. And the ancient DNA of pre-Columbian North Americans is telling stories that the archaeological record alone could only hint at. One of the most remarkable findings came from a study of ancient DNA from individuals associated with the Hopewell cultural tradition in Ohio. The analysis showed that the people buried in the Great Hopewell Mounds were not all from the same local population. Some of them were from far away. The genetic signatures pointed toward origins in regions far removed from Ohio, suggesting that the Hopewell gatherings at the major ceremonial centers were bringing people from across the continent's midsection together in the same place, and that some of those people stayed, at least long enough to be buried in the mounds. This is exactly what the artifact distributions had suggested, but having the genetic evidence transforms the picture. The Hopewell interaction sphere was not just a trade network where goods changed hands at a distance. It was a social world in which people moved, in which marriages occurred across enormous distances, in which the bonds that held the network together were personal and biological, as well as economic and ritual. Ancient DNA has also been revealing evidence of connections that nobody expected. A finding published in the last several years showed evidence of genetic contact between North American populations and Polynesian populations occurring before European contact, most likely on the Pacific coast of South America and possibly in other locations. The implications of this for understanding pre-Columbian maritime capabilities across the Pacific are enormous and are still being worked through by researchers who are simultaneously excited and cautious about what it means. If Pacific Islanders, the most accomplished open ocean navigators in human history, were reaching the Americas before Columbus, what else might have been crossing the Pacific in both directions? And if people were crossing the Pacific, what was the North American side of those encounters like? Who were the people on the beaches and headlands of the Pacific coast who first encountered the voyagers from Polynesia? And what did those encounters leave in the archaeological record that we have not yet learned to recognize? The Pacific coast of North America is itself full of mysteries that have only recently begun to receive the attention they deserve. For decades, the dominant model of how the Americas were peopled held that the first inhabitants arrived via the Bering Land Bridge during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were low enough that what is now the Bering Strait was a wide corridor of land connecting Siberia and Alaska. This model placed the arrival of humans in the Americas at roughly 13,000 years ago, just before the appearance of the Clovis culture, which was for many years regarded as the oldest, clearly documented human culture in the New World. That model is now thoroughly revised. The Clovis first hypothesis, as it was called, has been demolished by a series of discoveries that push the date of human presence in the Americas substantially earlier. Monteverde, in southern Chile, a site painstakingly excavated and dated over decades, has been accepted by mainstream archaeology as demonstrating human presence at least 14,500 years ago, possibly earlier. At its latitude in southern Chile, it is simply not reachable within a plausible timeframe from the Bering Land Bridge by the terrestrial routes that the Clovis first model assumed, unless people were already moving down the Pacific coast by watercraft before 13,000 years ago. Sites in North America are now also pushing dates back. Evidence from Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico suggests human presence as far back as 26,000 years ago. Evidence from several sites in the American Southeast is being re-examined with new dating methods that are producing ages older than the Clovis horizon. The accumulation of this evidence has produced a genuine scientific upheaval in the study of American prehistory, one that is still unfolding. The question is no longer whether people were in the Americas before Clovis. They were. The question is how much earlier, by what routes they came, and what their cultures were like in those earliest millennia before the better documented periods begin. What the revision of the peopling timeline means for understanding pre-Columbian American civilizations is profound, but often underappreciated, even within the scientific community. If people arrived in the Americas 20,000 or 25,000 years ago, rather than 13,000, then the total span of time available for cultures to develop, diversify, and achieve complexity is enormously longer than the old model assumed. 10 to 12,000 additional years of cultural development is not a trivial addition. In 10,000 years, from roughly 12,000 years ago to the present, human cultures went from small foraging bands to spacefaring civilizations. What might have developed in those additional millennia in the Americas, across a continent as ecologically diverse and resource-rich as North America, is a question that archaeology is only beginning to have the data to address. And the data, as it comes in, keeps suggesting that the development was more rapid, more complex, and more continental in its scope than previously assumed. Poverty point, at 3,500 years ago. The old copper complex, starting perhaps 7,000 years ago. The archaic period mound sites of the lower Mississippi Valley, some of which are now dated to 5,000 years ago, making them among the oldest organized earthwork traditions anywhere in the world. The timeline keeps extending, and with each extension, the picture of North American cultural history becomes less like the collection of disconnected episodes that the old model described, and more like a continuous tradition of complexity, whose roots reach deep into the post-glacial past. One of the places where this deep history is most dramatically visible is in the landscape itself. Across much of eastern North America, the forest is not natural, it is managed. The indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands used fire systematically to shape their environment, clearing understory to promote the growth of food-producing plants, maintaining open woodland that supported larger game populations, and creating the kind of park-like landscape that European explorers frequently described as if it were untouched wilderness, without recognizing that the aesthetic they found so appealing was the product of millennia of deliberate land management. The chestnut trees that once dominated the eastern forest, providing a reliable and abundant food source across an enormous range, were there in part because people had been promoting their growth for a very long time. The berry patches, the nut-producing trees, the river meadows full of wild food plants, these were not random features of a wild landscape. They were the signature of a food production system spread across millions of acres that did not look like a farm because it was not organized like a European farm. Researchers who have studied this tradition, which is now often described as indigenous forest management or agroforestry, have concluded that the pre-Columbian landscape of eastern North America was, in a meaningful sense, a garden. Not a garden in any small or contained sense, but a continental-scale managed landscape in which the diversity of species, the structure of plant communities, and the productivity of ecosystems had all been deliberately shaped over millennia by human intervention. The people doing the managing were not trying to maximize the yield of a single crop. They were maintaining a system whose complexity and resilience came from its diversity, from the fact that it produced many different foods in many different seasons, without requiring the kind of constant, intensive labor that European-style field agriculture demanded. This is a radically different vision of pre-Columbian North America than the one that most people were taught, and it has major implications, not just for how we understand history, but for how we think about the relationship between human societies and their environments. The model that most Western cultures inherited, a model in which wild nature is what you find before humans arrive and degrade it, simply does not fit the evidence from North America. What the evidence shows is a continent whose landscapes were actively managed, maintained, and shaped by human communities for thousands of years before European contact, in ways that produced ecological abundance rather than degradation. The forests were richer in useful species because people had been tending them. The rivers were full of fish because people had been managing the watersheds and in many cases constructing fish weirs and other harvesting structures that supported fish populations rather than depleting them. The grasslands of the Great Plains were maintained in their characteristic fire ecology, in part because of systematic burning by plains peoples who understood exactly what fire did to bison habitat. When European diseases swept through North American indigenous populations in the centuries after contact, killing an estimated 90% of people in many regions, the managed landscapes began to revert to something wilder, less productive, and less diverse. The forests grew denser. The productive openings closed in. The berry patches were overwhelmed by competing vegetation. And when European settlers arrived in force, they inherited a landscape that was in the process of recovering from one of the most catastrophic depopulation events in human history, and interpreted what they found as primeval wilderness that had always been that way. They were wrong. What they called wilderness was a landscape in ecological recovery, grief expressed in vegetation, the absence of the hands that had tended it for generations written in the gradual encroachment of less useful species over the carefully managed communities their predecessors had maintained. This context matters when thinking about the mysterious places of North America, because many of them are mysterious partly because we have been reading them without the context of the world they were built in. When we see a massive earthwork in the Ohio Valley and ask why anyone would have built it here, in this remote forested place, we are projecting onto a prehistoric landscape the characteristics of the modern landscape. The forests that now surround the Newark earthworks, or the Hopewell mounds, were not there when those structures were in use. The landscape was open, managed, productive, and populated. The earthworks sat in the center of communities, not in remote wilderness. Understanding what was built requires recovering, at least imaginatively, the world that was built in. And that world had roads. This is one of the most consistently surprising findings of recent decades of North American archaeological research, how extensively the continent was networked by engineered routes of travel and communication long before European contact. The Chacoan roads of the Southwest are the most famous example, but they are not alone. In the Southeast, a series of carefully maintained routes connected major ceremonial centers across hundreds of miles. In the Northeast, the trail systems of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, were so well maintained and so efficiently routed that many of them became the basis for colonial-era roads and later for modern highways. The trail that became the route of the Erie Canal followed a natural gap in the Appalachians that indigenous travelers had been using for thousands of years. The Great Hopewell Road is perhaps the most dramatic example of ancient American infrastructure that remains controversial and underexplored. The idea of a direct road connecting the Great Hopewell ceremonial centers of the Newark earthworks in Ohio to the Chillicothe complex, 60 miles to the south, was proposed by researchers decades ago based on survey evidence and has been periodically supported and disputed since. What is not disputed is that there was an enormous amount of movement along this corridor, that the artifact assemblages at the two ends of the proposed road share features that suggest regular and direct communication, and that the alignment between the two major complexes is not accidental. Whether the physical road itself will ever be convincingly documented across its full extent is uncertain. The landscape has been substantially modified by modern development, but the connection between the two centers is real, and the question of how it was maintained is one that continues to produce interesting research. What is known about ancient American travel is that it was more extensive, more organized, and more rapid than most people assume. Long-distance runners carried messages between communities at speeds that, for the distances involved, were comparable to pre-telegraph communication rates in early modern Europe. The Aztec postal system, documented at the time of Spanish contact, used relay runners to move news across the empire at speeds of up to 200 miles per day. There is no reason to think this was a late innovation. All the evidence suggests it was an elaboration of practices that had been in use across Mesoamerica and North America for a very long time. Canoe travel on the continent's extensive river systems moved goods, people, and information even faster in favorable conditions. The Mississippi-Missouri-Ohio river system is one of the largest interconnected waterways in the world, and people who had grown up paddling its tributaries from childhood could traverse it with an efficiency and a geographic knowledge that allowed them to function as the highways of their civilization. Against this background of connectivity and movement, the specific mysteries of particular sites take on a different character. They are not isolated puzzles, they are nodes in a network, and understanding any one of them fully requires at least some awareness of the network they were part of. Serpent Mound in southern Ohio is a case in point. It is one of the most visited and most photographed prehistoric sites in North America, and it remains one of the most debated. The Great Serpent Mound is an effigy mound, a mound built in the shape of a living creature, in this case, an enormous serpent stretching nearly a quarter of a mile along a ridge above a creek in Adams County. The serpent's body coils and curves in shape. At its head, the jaws open around what appears to be an oval object, which has been interpreted as an egg, a sun, a comet, or an eye, depending on which researcher you ask. The serpent mound is aligned. The head of the serpent points toward the summer solstice sunset. The first curve of the body aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. Other curves in the body align with the equinox sunrises and sunsets, and with the extreme moonrise and moonset positions of the lunar standstill. The structure is, in other words, an effigy that is simultaneously a calendar, encoding in the curves of a serpent's body the full astronomical framework of the sun and moon as they move through their cycles above this Ohio ridge. The dating of Serpent Mound has been a source of controversy. Initial analysis placed it in the Hopewell period, roughly 2,000 years ago. Later analysis of charcoal samples from within the mound suggested a much more recent date, somewhere between 900 and 1100 years ago, placing it in the Mississippian period and close to the time of Cahokia's fluorescence. Most recent research has complicated this picture further, suggesting the possibility that the mound was built in stages over a long period and that different parts of it may date to different periods. The location itself, a prominent ridge above a creek valley at the edge of a geological formation called the Serpent Mound crypto-explosion structure, which is the remnant of a meteor impact or possible volcanic event of enormous age, adds another layer to the mystery. Was the site chosen because of this unusual geological feature? Did the anomalous landscape, the circular depression, the shattered and upthrust rock, carry some significance for the people who chose it as the site for their serpent? These questions have not been resolved, but the fact that people chose this specific and geologically unusual location for one of the continent's most elaborate astronomical earthworks suggests that the choice was deliberate and meaningful. Standing at Serpent Mound today, especially at dawn on a solstice morning when a small crowd gathers to watch the sunrise align with the serpent's coils, it is possible to feel something of what the site was built to communicate. The alignment is not subtle. When the sun rises at the right point on the horizon and its light falls along the curve of the mound's body, the engineering of the thing becomes viscerally apparent. Someone built this. Someone who understood the sky, who understood the geometry of the landscape, who understood how to move Earth in a way that preserved alignments across centuries, built this specific thing in this specific place to capture this specific astronomical event. That person is gone. Their name is gone. Their community is gone. But the earthwork remains, and every year on the solstice, it does what it was built to do. Effigy mounds are another category of American mysterious places that have received less attention than their scale and artistry deserve. Concentrated especially in the upper Midwest, particularly in southern Wisconsin and adjacent areas, effigy mounds are earthen structures built in the shapes of animals, birds, water spirits, and human figures, often arranged in groups that may number in the dozens at a single site. The animals most commonly represented are bears, birds, deer, and what researchers call panthers or underwater spirits, creatures that appear to be some combination of mammal, serpent, and aquatic being. These panthers appear repeatedly in the symbolic tradition of indigenous North America, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, representing a category of spiritual being associated with the underworld, with water, and with power that requires careful management. The effigy mound tradition of Wisconsin and the upper Midwest flourished between roughly 700 and 1200 years ago, overlapping in time with both the later Hopewell period and the Mississippian period that produced Cahokia. Many of the mounds contain burials, but not all. Some appear to have served as ceremonial spaces for activities that did not involve burial. The layouts of effigy mound groups often show careful orientation, with bird mounds positioned to face east and sunrise, with bear mounds aligned to specific landscape features or celestial points. The relationships between different mounds within a group appear to encode cosmological concepts, mapping the structure of the universe onto the landscape in a way that transformed ordinary land into sacred space. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, agricultural development and urban expansion destroyed the vast majority of Wisconsin's effigy mounds. The ones that survive do so in protected parks and on private land where owners have chosen preservation over development. The loss is incalculable. Thousands of earthen figures, each one representing countless hours of labor and a specific intention on the part of its builders, are gone. What they communicated, what knowledge they encoded, what ceremonies were performed in their presence, we can only partially reconstruct from the survivors and from ethnographic accounts of the people whose ancestors built them. The Ho-Chunk, or Winnebago, people of Wisconsin maintain traditions that connect directly to the effigy mound builders. In Ho-Chunk cosmology, the fundamental opposition between the upper world and the lower world, between Thunderbird and Water Panther, between sky power and earth power, is encoded in the effigy mound landscape of southern Wisconsin in a way that makes the mound groupings readable as cosmological maps once you know the symbolic vocabulary. The bear mounds represent earth power, associated with the lower world. The bird mounds represent sky power, associated with the upper world. When they are placed together in a mound group, they map out the fundamental structure of the Ho-Chunk cosmos onto a particular piece of ground, making that ground a place where the two realms meet and where the relationship between them can be managed through ceremony. This interpretive framework, which was developed in collaboration between Ho-Chunk knowledge holders and academic archaeologists over several decades beginning in the 1980s, transformed the study of effigy mounds. It showed that the mounds were not just aesthetic objects or simple burial features. They were theological statements, cosmological maps, permanent inscriptions of a belief system on the landscape. And it showed that the people whose belief system is inscribed in those mounds are still present, still maintaining knowledge of what was built and why, still able to read the landscape in ways that no amount of purely archaeological analysis could fully recover. This points toward one of the most important developments in American archaeology in the last generation, the shift toward genuine collaboration between indigenous communities and archaeological researchers. The history of American archaeology is in many ways a history of indigenous knowledge being ignored, appropriated, or actively suppressed in favor of interpretive frameworks developed entirely by outsiders. The consequences of that approach are visible in the number of mysteries that remain mysterious. Sites whose significance was obvious to the people whose ancestors built them, but opaque to the researchers who studied them without that context. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, required institutions holding indigenous remains and sacred objects to return them to affiliated communities and created a legal framework for consultation between tribes and archaeologists. The effect has been transformative in ways that go beyond the repatriation of specific objects. It initiated a process of relationship building between archaeologists and indigenous communities that has, in many cases, produced collaborative research of a quality and depth that neither party could have achieved alone. When archaeologists studying the Chacoan system began working closely with Pueblo communities, the interpretations of specific architectural features, specific artifact types, and specific spatial arrangements changed dramatically, because Pueblo knowledge holders recognized things that the purely archaeological analysis had missed or misread. Similar collaborations around Cahokia have produced important insights into the ceremonial and cosmological meanings of the site's layout. Collaborations around the Hopewell Mounds have illuminated the social organization of Hopewell gatherings and the spiritual significance of the specific goods buried in Hopewell mortuary contexts. The knowledge that indigenous communities hold about these sites is not a supplement to archaeological understanding. In many cases, it is the only access available to the most important dimensions of what these places were and what they were for. This is worth sitting with, because it runs counter to a persistent cultural assumption in Western science, the assumption that indigenous oral traditions are unreliable as historical sources and that only material evidence can tell us true things about the past. The research of the last several decades has repeatedly shown this assumption to be wrong. Oral traditions have proven to be accurate records of events that occurred thousands of years ago. Geological knowledge preserved in indigenous traditions about volcanic eruptions, earthquake-generated tsunamis, and changes in sea level has been verified by geological research. Astronomical knowledge preserved in oral traditions has been confirmed by astronomers. Ecological knowledge that seemed implausibly detailed when anthropologists first recorded it has been validated by ecologists who later studied the same systems. The traditions are not always preserved in forms that are easy for outsiders to access or interpret. They are embedded in stories, in ceremonial practices, in the specific words of songs that have been sung for generations. The knowledge does not announce itself as knowledge. It must be drawn out carefully by people who understand the cultural contexts it is embedded in. But it is there, and it is real, and the scientific community's relationship to it has fundamentally changed over the last generation. Now let's go to a place that most Americans have never heard of, and that sits within a day's drive of tens of millions of people. Crystal River Archaeological State Park in Citrus County, Florida, is not a famous site. It does not appear in most history curricula. It is not the subject of popular documentaries the way the Southwest Pueblos or the Ohio Mounds are. But what happened at Crystal River over a period of roughly 1,600 years represents one of the longest continuously occupied ceremonial sites in North American prehistory, and what researchers have found there in the last decade is changing the understanding of ancient Florida in ways that have surprised even specialists in the field. The site at Crystal River consists of a series of earthen mounds arranged around a central plaza on the bank of the Crystal River on Florida's Gulf Coast. The mounds served multiple functions over the site's long occupation: burial mounds, temple mounds, and what appear to be residential and activity areas around the ceremonial core. The site was in use from roughly 200 years before the Common Era until roughly 1,400 years of the Common Era, a span of over 15 centuries, during which it served as one of the premier ceremonial destinations on the Gulf Coast. People came to Crystal River from hundreds of miles away. The evidence for this is in the materials found in the burial mounds: copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, galena from Missouri, artifacts in the style of the Ohio Hopewell tradition appearing in a Florida Gulf Coast site with complete fluency, as if the people buried at Crystal River were full participants in the Hopewell world, even from their distant coastal outpost. What the most recent research at Crystal River has revealed is that the site's layout encodes an astronomical alignment that connects it to the same tradition of solar and lunar observation documented at the Ohio sites. The main axis of the site, from the burial mound complex to the temple mound at the far end of the plaza, is oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise. On the morning of the winter solstice, the sun rises directly along this axis. A researcher standing at the burial mounds and looking toward the temple mound sees the sun come up directly over it. This is not accidental. The precision of the alignment makes clear that it was deliberate. Someone in the early centuries of the Common Era, or possibly earlier, laid out the Crystal River Ceremonial Center with the same orientation principles that appear in Ohio, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in New Mexico. The Gulf Coast of Florida is not usually thought of as a center of ancient astronomical sophistication. Florida tends to get described in pre-Columbian narratives as a peripheral area, a place where simpler cultures lived on shellfish and fish without the complex social organization of the great mound-building traditions. The evidence from Crystal River and from a series of other Florida sites that have received closer attention in the last 20 years makes clear that this description was always wrong. The Calusa people of southwest Florida, whose society flourished in the centuries just before and after European contact, maintained a chiefdom of remarkable organization and sophistication, exercising political control over a large region, constructing extensive canal systems, and developing a philosophy of political authority and cosmological order that rivaled anything in the southeast. Their predecessors at Crystal River were connected to the broadest and most complex cultural network on the continent. The canal systems of the Calusa are another piece of the Florida mystery that is only now receiving the attention it deserves. On the southwest coast of Florida, particularly around Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound, the Calusa constructed a network of water management features that transformed the landscape over centuries. Channels connecting shallow coastal bays allowed canoe travel across distances that would otherwise require open water crossings. Fish weirs and traps exploited the tidal flows of estuaries to harvest fish at scales sufficient to support large populations without agriculture. Watercourts associated with major ceremonial sites created managed aquatic spaces whose purposes remain only partially understood. The LiDAR surveys of this coastal landscape that have been conducted in the last decade reveal a network of engineered water features spread across hundreds of square miles, the material signature of a civilization that organized its world around water in ways that shaped the coastal environment as thoroughly as any agricultural society shaped its farmland. Just to the north of the Calusa territory, in the Tampa Bay area, and extending up the Gulf Coast, another tradition of extraordinary earthwork construction flourished. The Safety Harbor culture, named for an archaeological site near the city of that name, built temple mounds along the coast whose scale and organization suggest connections to the Mississippian tradition centered at Cahokia, while also maintaining a distinctly regional identity. The largest of these mounds have been substantially damaged by development over the last century, but even in their reduced state, they communicate the ambition and the organizational capacity of the societies that built them. Florida is full of buried histories. Literally. The state's karst geology, with its limestone bedrock and extensive cave systems, preserves organic materials under certain conditions that would not survive in other environments. Wooden artifacts thousands of years old have been found in Florida's peat bogs and submerged archaeological sites in conditions of remarkable preservation. A site in Sarasota County produced a collection of wooden artifacts and human remains dating to roughly 7,000 years ago that included carved wooden objects, suggesting symbolic or ceremonial use at a date so early that it requires completely revising assumptions about the cultural complexity of the people who inhabited Florida at the end of the last ice age. The submerged sites off Florida's coast represent one of the most exciting and least explored frontiers of North American archaeology. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were substantially lower than today, the Florida peninsula was much larger than it is now. The continental shelf extending west from the modern coastline into the Gulf of Mexico was dry land, and people lived on it. As sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, those coastal settlements were inundated. They now lie under anywhere from a few meters to tens of meters of water on the continental shelf. Archaeological survey of portions of this submerged landscape has already revealed stone tool scatters, bone accumulations, and other evidence of human occupation at depths corresponding to sea levels from 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. Systematic underwater archaeology in these areas is in its early stages, hampered by the difficulty and expense of underwater excavation. But what is already visible in the survey data suggests that the submerged Gulf Shelf may contain some of the earliest and best preserved records of human occupation in North America. The submerged landscape problem is not unique to Florida. All along the North American coastline, ancient shorelines now lie underwater, and the communities that occupied them are largely unknown because they cannot be reached by conventional archaeology. The eastern seaboard, the Gulf Coast, the Pacific Northwest coast, Alaska's island chains, all of these coastlines had occupied areas during the glacial maximum that are now underwater. The Kelp Forest Highway hypothesis, which proposes that early Americans moved down the Pacific coast following a productive coastal ecosystem, implies that the most important archaeological evidence for the earliest American coastal migration is now submerged. Retrieving it will require technology and investment of a kind that has not yet been committed to this problem. What is beginning to be done is a combination of acoustic seafloor mapping, which can identify features that might be archaeological sites on submerged coastal terraces, and targeted sampling and excavation in areas where the mapping results are promising. The results to date have been encouraging. Submerged sites have been identified and sampled in the Gulf of Mexico, along the California coast, in the waters of the Pacific Northwest, and in the nearshore waters off Alaska. Each of these sites represents a window into a coastal world that pre-Clovis peoples inhabited long before the better documented interior cultures appeared. As the technology improves and the investment in underwater archaeology increases, this submerged history is going to become increasingly visible, and it is very likely to produce findings that further revise the timeline and the geography of North American prehistory. In the Pacific Northwest, the mystery takes a different form. Here, the indigenous cultures of the coast developed one of the most complex and distinctive non-agricultural civilizations in the world, a civilization based on the extraordinary abundance of salmon, halibut, and other marine resources that allowed dense populations, elaborate social hierarchies, monumental art, sophisticated ceremonial traditions, and extensive trade networks to develop without the cultivation of any significant field crops. The peoples of the northwest coast, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and many others, are often described in the anthropological literature as an anomaly. Complex hunter-gatherers who achieved levels of social organization normally associated with agricultural societies. The anomaly, if that is what it is, has deep roots. The archaeological record of the northwest coast shows the emergence of increasing social complexity, stretching back several thousand years, with evidence of status differentiation in burials, large-scale harvesting and storage facilities, long-distance trade, and elaborately carved ceremonial objects going back much further than most people realize. The famous totem poles of the northwest coast, the most visible artistic tradition associated with this region in the modern popular imagination, are themselves relatively recent in their current monumental form, a tradition that was energized and elaborated in the period after European contact, when access to metal tools made large-scale carving far easier than it had been with stone tools. But the symbolic system encoded in the poles, the clan animals, the mythological narratives, the cosmological concepts, these are ancient, rooted in a spiritual and intellectual tradition whose origins reach back to the deepest layers of the archaeological record. One of the most striking features of Northwest Coast prehistory is the evidence for catastrophic disruption and resilience. The coast is geologically active. The Cascadia subduction zone runs along it, and great earthquakes occur there periodically. Evidence from multiple sites shows layers of destruction followed by reoccupation and rebuilding, the archaeological signature of communities adapting to and recovering from geological catastrophe. Indigenous oral traditions of the region preserve accounts of great earthquakes, of tsunamis that swept coastal villages away, of the ground shaking so badly that trees fell and rivers changed course. These traditions have been matched to specific geological events in the stratigraphic record with remarkable precision. A tradition preserved among the Makah of Washington state describes a tsunami that destroyed their ancestors' village at Ozette. Excavation at Ozette found a mudslide-preserved village with remarkable organic remains, sealed by the event the tradition describes, dating to roughly 300 years ago. The tradition was accurate. Further north along the coast, in the waters of the Inside Passage, archaeologists working in collaboration with Haida and Tlingit communities have been finding evidence of ancient settlements now submerged by rising sea levels, in some cases precisely where oral traditions said to look. The traditions spoke of islands where villages had stood, now covered by water. The acoustic surveys and dive surveys confirmed the presence of archaeological remains at those locations. The knowledge had been preserved in the oral record across the generations that separated the occupation of those submerged places from the present day. The Southwest is full of sites that are well known but not well understood. Mesa Verde in Colorado is visited by hundreds of thousands of tourists each year who tour the cliff dwellings with guides who explain the basic facts. Ancestral Pueblo people, 13th century construction, abandoned in the 1280s. What the standard tour does not usually convey is the depth and complexity of what happened at Mesa Verde and in the region surrounding it over the several centuries of its intense occupation, the astronomical sophistication of the Great Tower complexes, the long-distance communication systems that connected the Mesa-top communities to each other and to the wider world, and the profound mystery of what the abandonment actually represented. The towers of Mesa Verde are among the most technically accomplished prehistoric masonry structures in North America. The circular towers built into the cliff, alcoves alongside the famous cliff dwellings, were constructed with a precision that leaves modern observers puzzled. The walls are plumb, the courses are even, the mortar joints are tight, and the interiors of the towers show evidence of sophisticated use of light in ways that researchers are still working to fully understand. Certain towers have windows positioned so that specific celestial events, solstice sunrises, lunar alignments can be observed through them from specific interior positions. The towers were observatories, or they functioned as part of an observation system, and they were integrated into a network of line-of-sight communication that connected Mesa Verde to other communities across a landscape that seems, from the evidence, to have been organized as a unified information system. The Aztec Ruins National Monument in New Mexico, despite its misleading name, the site has nothing to do with the Aztec civilization of Mexico, represents another node in this southwestern information and ceremonial network. Built in the early 12th century as a Chacoan outlier, it contains a great house whose architecture mirrors the Chacoan great houses in the canyon to the south, with the same wall construction techniques, the same room organization, the same astronomical alignments. Later, after the decline of the Chacoan system, the site was reoccupied and modified by what archaeologists call the Mesa Verde tradition. A great kiva at Aztec was carefully reconstructed in the 1930s and remains one of the most complete examples of this distinctive architectural form visible to modern visitors. Standing in the reconstructed kiva, in the round, underground ceremonial space that could hold hundreds of people at a time, it is not difficult to feel the weight of the ceremonies that took place there, even without knowing their specific content. What is remarkable about the Aztec site from a research perspective is that it preserves a unique record of cultural transition. The Chacoan layer is visible in the Great House architecture and in the artifacts from the Chacoan period. The Mesa Verde layer is visible in the modifications made to the site in the later period and in the different ceramic styles of the later occupation. And underlying both of them, in the landscape around the Great House, are the traces of an earlier occupation, an archaic period site whose features are only partially revealed by the limited excavation that has been done in those areas. The site has layers, as most long-occupied places in the southwest do, and each layer tells part of a larger story about the way this corner of the continent was organized across time. The Galisteo Basin, south of Santa Fe, is a region where the collision between deep indigenous history and the modern world is particularly vivid. The basin contains dozens of large pueblo sites dating from the 13th to the 17th centuries, many of them with rock art panels of extraordinary complexity covering the cliff faces near the village ruins. The rock art of the Galisteo Basin includes hunting scenes, ceremonial imagery, cosmological diagrams, and what appear to be historical records of specific events, depicted in a visual vocabulary that is only partially understood even after a century of research. Some of the images clearly connect to traditions that are still alive in the contemporary Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley. Others are more enigmatic, belonging to stylistic traditions that cannot be directly connected to any documented oral or ceremonial tradition. One of the most striking recurring images in the rock art of the Galisteo Basin and elsewhere in the southwest is the horned serpent, a being whose combination of serpentine body, horned head, and feathered elements appears from Chaco in the north to the ancient cultures of Mesoamerica in the south. The horned serpent, called Awanyu by the Tewa-speaking Pueblo peoples, is one of the most widely distributed supernatural beings in all of North American indigenous religion, appearing in artistic and ceremonial contexts, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, from Canada to Central America. Its persistence and distribution suggest that it belongs to a layer of shared cosmological tradition that is genuinely ancient, predating the cultural differentiation of North American indigenous traditions by thousands of years. The distribution of the horned serpent image and of other widely shared symbolic elements like the hand and eye motif of the southeastern ceremonial complex, the world tree, the four directions organization of ceremonial space, raises questions about the origins and antiquity of shared cosmological frameworks across North American indigenous cultures. Are these shared elements the result of continued contact and exchange between traditions? Are they remnants of a much older common origin, preserved in different forms by cultures that diverged from a common ancestor? Are they independent developments that converged on similar symbolic solutions to similar existential questions? These questions are at the frontier of the anthropological study of North American religion and mythology, and the answers are far from settled. What is clear is that the shared symbolic vocabulary of pre-Columbian North America is more extensive and more coherent than most people realize. The worlds of Chaco and Cahokia and the Ohio Hopewell and the Florida Gulf Coast were not as separate as they appeared to early researchers working with limited evidence and limited comparative perspective. They were participating in overlapping networks of symbol and belief that stretched across the continent, networks whose specific configurations changed over time, but whose underlying framework remained recognizable across enormous distances and enormous stretches of time. Take the story further east. Cross the Mississippi, cross the Appalachians, and enter the world of the eastern seaboard, a world that tends to be dramatically underrepresented in discussions of pre-Columbian American mystery because the dominant historical narrative of the East Coast begins with European colonization and struggles to accommodate the idea that what the colonists found here was not a simple landscape, but the remnant of a complex world. That disease had already begun to devastate before any systematic European observation was recorded. The Virginia Algonquian chiefdom that John Smith encountered in 1607, the confederacy of communities that he described as ruled by Wahun Seneca, the paramount chief, the English called Powhatan, was not a simple tribal structure. It was a multi-level political system, exercising authority over dozens of communities across a large region, collecting tribute, conducting diplomacy, maintaining a network of intelligence about neighboring peoples and distant threats, and organizing its world in terms of a cosmological framework of considerable elaboration. The English observers who recorded this world were not well equipped to understand it, partly because of the linguistic and cultural distance between them and the people they were observing, and partly because much of what they were looking at was already a shadow of what it had been before epidemic disease began its work. The Chesapeake region that Powhatan's confederacy occupied had been organized by complex societies for a very long time before the chiefdom that Smith encountered. Archaeological research in the region has documented a sequence of increasingly complex social organization stretching back several thousand years, with evidence of long-distance exchange, specialized craft production, and ceremonial centers at multiple points in that sequence. The Accokeek site on the Potomac River in Maryland, which has been continuously occupied and repeatedly revisited as a ceremonial location for thousands of years, shows evidence of connections to the Hopewell tradition far to the west. The Piscataway people whose descendants still live in the region maintain traditions about their ancestral relationship to this landscape that reach back far beyond the documented historical period. The northeastern woodlands present their own set of mysteries. The Haudenosaunee, the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy, is one of the most studied indigenous political institutions in North America, and with reason. The Confederacy, whose founding is dated by different scholars to anywhere between 900 and 400 years before European contact, represents one of the most sophisticated political systems documented in the pre-Columbian world, a federal structure, linking 5 previously independent nations in a common governance framework through a set of founding principles recorded in what is called the Great Law of Peace. The Great Law is a constitutional document in a meaningful sense. It establishes the governance structures of the Confederacy, defines the rights and responsibilities of its member nations and their citizens, creates mechanisms for resolving disputes between nations, and describes the principles on which political authority rests. Scholars of constitutional history have noted for decades that the Great Law contains principles that appear in the United States Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. Federal structure, balancing central authority with the sovereignty of member units, bicameral deliberation, consensus decision-making, rights of individuals vis-à-vis the state, mechanisms for removal of leaders who violated their trust. The question of how much influence the Haudenosaunee political system had on the thinking of the American founding fathers has been debated for generations. There is documented evidence that Benjamin Franklin knew the Haudenosaunee system and admired it. There is less documented evidence of specific borrowing of specific constitutional features. But the conversation that American political thinkers were having with the indigenous political traditions of the continent they were inhabiting is more substantial and more complex than most standard accounts of American constitutional history acknowledge. The Haudenosaunee homeland in what is now New York State is also a landscape of ancient archaeology whose complexity is only beginning to be understood. The longhouse sites of the 17th and 16th and 15th centuries, that have been systematically excavated show communities of considerable size and social organization, with longhouses each housing multiple families arranged in villages that were rebuilt and relocated every decade or so as the resources of the surrounding forest were exhausted and needed time to recover. This pattern of deliberate rotation through a landscape, burning, farming, fishing a location for a generation, then moving and allowing it to regenerate, represents a sophisticated system of land management that produced sustainable yields from the northeastern forest over a period of centuries. Before the Haudenosaunee and their immediate predecessors, the same New York landscape was occupied by cultures whose archaeological record has produced some of the most intriguing and least explained sites in the Northeast. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in western Pennsylvania, not far from the New York border, has produced dates for human occupation that go back 16,000 years or more, making it one of the candidate sites for pre-Clovis occupation in eastern North America. The site has been the subject of controversy since its excavations in the 1970s, but the archaeological team that worked it followed rigorous protocols, and independent researchers who have reviewed the evidence have generally found it credible. If Meadowcroft was occupied 16,000 years ago, it was occupied during the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets covered Canada to the north but left western Pennsylvania ice-free, a refugium in which plants, animals, and people could survive the cold. The implications of early occupation in the East are significant for understanding the distribution of cultural complexity that we see in the later archaeological record. If people were in eastern North America for 16,000 years or more before the earliest well-documented cultures of the woodland period, they had a great deal of time to develop the ecological knowledge, the social institutions, and the cultural frameworks that we see elaborated in the earthwork traditions and the political sophistication of later periods. The Ohio Hopewell, the Mississippian tradition, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, none of these institutions arose from nothing. They arose from communities that had been in their landscapes for a very long time, accumulating knowledge and developing social solutions to the challenges of life in the eastern woodlands. The depth of that occupation, now extending back much further than traditional models assumed, is part of what makes the achievements of the historic and late prehistoric periods comprehensible rather than anomalous. Up in Maine and the Canadian Maritimes, another ancient tradition is coming into clearer focus through recent research. The Red Paint people, formerly known as the Maritime Archaic tradition, flourished between roughly 7,000 and 3,500 years ago along the coasts and rivers of the northeastern seaboard and what is now Atlantic Canada. They were marine hunters, pursuing swordfish, seals, and other large marine prey in open water using harpoons and ocean-going canoes at a period when such technology was considered by many researchers to be impossible for what the terminology called archaic peoples. The evidence forced revision. The maritime archaic sites, at locations like Rattler's Bight in Labrador and Turner Farm in Maine, show sophisticated maritime technology, elaborate burial practices including the red ochre, for which the tradition is named, extensive long-distance trade in materials including rama chert from northern Labrador that was exchanged across enormous distances, and evidence of a social organization capable of marshalling the resources and the skills needed for open ocean big game hunting. The maritime archaic people were making ocean crossings and exploiting deep water resources more than 5,000 years ago. They were trading materials across what is now Canada and New England in a network whose scope is only apparent from the distribution of their distinctive rama chert tools, which show up in archaeological sites from Labrador to Maine, representing exchanges of high-quality raw material across distances of 1,000 miles and more, and then, around 3,500 years ago, they disappeared from the archaeological record, overlapping in time with the southward expansion of the Dorset culture from the Arctic, the immediate predecessor of the Thule people who became the modern Inuit. What happened between the maritime archaic and the subsequent traditions of the Northeast is one of the unresolved questions of Northeastern archaeology, a replacement or transformation whose mechanisms are not clear from the available evidence. The archaeology of the Arctic and subarctic regions of North America adds yet another dimension to the continental story that is rarely incorporated into discussions of American mystery and prehistory. The Dorset people, who occupied the eastern Arctic for roughly 2,000 years before being replaced by or absorbed into the Thule tradition, developed one of the most distinctive and, in many ways, most technically accomplished material cultures in the world, under conditions of cold and isolation that make their achievements all the more remarkable. Dorset art, in particular, is extraordinary. Small ivory and bone carvings of animals, human figures, and supernatural beings executed with a technical mastery and an expressive power that strikes most observers who encounter them as among the finest small-scale sculpture ever produced in any tradition anywhere. The Dorset carved their world. They made tiny bears that look as if they are breathing. They made masks, whose combinations of human and animal features embody concepts of transformation and spiritual passage that parallel shamanic traditions across the entire circumpolar zone. They made images of skeletal beings, figures whose bones are visible through their flesh, which are now understood as representations of the X-ray vision that shamanic traditions across the Arctic describe as a capacity of spiritual practitioners. The ability to see through surfaces to the underlying structure of things. These tiny carvings, some of them no larger than a thumb, are not decorative objects. They are theological and philosophical statements, encoded in ivory and bone by people who lived at the extreme edge of the habitable world and who developed a spiritual tradition of remarkable depth and sophistication in response to their environment. The tool tradition that followed the Dorset introduced a technological revolution to the Arctic that enabled the exploitation of bowhead whales, the largest animals that had ever been systematically hunted anywhere in the world. Thule whale hunting required large crews working in coordinated teams from multiple umiaks, the large open skin boats that could carry a dozen or more people. It required weapon systems of considerable sophistication, including toggle-head harpoons that locked inside the prey after penetrating, and floats that slowed and tired the whale while the hunting team pursued it. It required the ability to process a 50-ton animal after the hunt, extracting the blubber, meat, and bone that would sustain an Arctic community through months of winter darkness. And it required a social organization capable of coordinating all of this and distributing the proceeds in a way that maintained community cohesion across the tensions that such high-stakes communal enterprise inevitably generates. Thule communities built houses from whale bones, using the massive jaws and ribs as structural elements in a way that echoed, in a very different environment and material tradition, the mammoth bone houses of the Ice Age. They maintained kayaks of extraordinary hydrodynamic sophistication, the design of which has been studied and adapted by modern kayak builders who find that the traditional Greenlandic and Alaskan forms are nearly optimal for their intended purpose. They navigated the ice-choked waters of the Arctic coast with a precision and a safety record that modern observers find astonishing, given that they were doing it in skin boats without any of the navigation aids that modern boaters consider essential. They read the ice, the currents, the winds, the behavior of sea creatures, and the positions of the stars, with an intimate knowledge of their marine environment that represented generations of accumulated experience passed down through the oral and practical tradition of their communities. Come back south. Come back to the continent's interior, to the places where water is not frozen year-round, but is still the organizing principle of the landscape. The rivers of the American interior were not just transportation routes. They were the centers of economic and political life in ways that modern river management has entirely obscured. The free-flowing Mississippi before the Army Corps of Engineers reshaped it was a dynamic, constantly changing system of channels, backwaters, floodplains, oxbow lakes, and wetlands that produced one of the most biologically productive environments on the continent. The floodplain communities that built their lives around this system had access to fish, waterfowl, freshwater mussels, riverine plant foods, and the agricultural lands of the natural levees, in a combination of resources that could support large populations with relatively modest labor inputs compared to what dryland farming required. The cultures of the lower Mississippi Valley, stretching from the confluence of the Arkansas River south to the Gulf of Mexico, developed a distinctive tradition of mound building and ceremonial organization that in some respects paralleled, and in other respects preceded the better-known Cahokian tradition further north. Poverty Point, as discussed earlier, is the ancient anchor of this tradition, but it had successors and elaborators. The Marksville culture of the first few centuries of the Common Era shows strong Hopewell connections with burial mounds, whose contents parallel those of the Ohio mounds in their combination of exotic materials and ceremonial elaboration. The Coles Creek tradition that followed represents another phase of development in the Lower Valley, with platform mound centers that anticipate the fully elaborated Mississippian tradition. The Natchez people, whose society was documented in unusual detail by French observers in the early 18th century before epidemic disease and colonial violence destroyed it, appear to have preserved some of the most archaic features of the southeastern mound-building tradition into the historical period. The Natchez paramount chief, called the Great Sun, lived on a platform mound, was carried about on a litter rather than walking on the ground, was surrounded by elaborate protocol that restricted the behavior of all others in his presence, and was accompanied in death by the ritual killing of those who chose to follow him to the afterlife. The Natchez ceremonial complex centered on a sacred fire that was kept burning continuously on the temple mound and whose extinction would have represented a cosmic catastrophe. The Great Sun's house faced east, and the ceremonial calendar was organized around solar events in a way that resonated with the astronomical traditions visible in the much older archaeological sites of the region. When French observers described the Natchez, they were describing the last visible expression of a tradition that had roots reaching back through the Mississippian period to Poverty Point and beyond. The institutional forms had changed over the intervening millennia, but the underlying framework of solar ceremonialism, platform mound architecture, and hierarchically organized political authority that derived its legitimacy from cosmological claims was continuous across 3,000 years of cultural history in the lower Mississippi Valley. The Natchez were not a throwback or a remnant. They were the living continuation of a tradition as old as classical antiquity. The systematic destruction of the Natchez and the burning of their ceremonial centers in the 1720s was not just a military and political event. It was an act of cultural erasure that destroyed the institutional memory of one of the oldest continuous ceremonial traditions in North America. The sacred fire was extinguished. The temple mound was abandoned. The social structure that had organized Natchez life was shattered. The French colonial authorities who accomplished this destruction did not understand what they were destroying. They understood it as a threat, as a competing political power, and they dealt with it as such. What was lost with the Natchez is incalculable, but not everything was lost. The descendants of the Natchez who survived fled to neighboring peoples and were absorbed into other communities. Their knowledge, their stories, their ceremonial traditions did not entirely disappear. They went underground, were preserved in changed and hidden forms, and have been maintained by the communities that sheltered Natchez refugees. Researchers working with those communities in the 20th and 21st centuries have recovered fragments of what was preserved, and what they have found confirms that the institutional complexity documented by French observers was the expression of a much older and deeper tradition than the documentary record alone could suggest. The mounds of the Southeast are perhaps the richest and most varied collection of ancient earthworks anywhere in North America. From the enormous platform mounds of Moundville in Alabama, a Mississippian center second in size only to Cahokia, to the elaborate geometric earthworks of the Florida Panhandle, to the conical burial mounds scattered across the Carolinas and Tennessee, the Southeast is a landscape inscribed with the evidence of 3,000 years of complex social life. Many of these sites are now within cities, suburbs, or agricultural land, their original context destroyed and their full extent unknown. Some are protected in state and national parks. Many were dug into by 19th century amateur investigators who were primarily interested in the objects they could find inside the mounds and who destroyed the stratigraphic record in the process of extracting them. Moundville in Alabama is one of the best preserved and most studied of the great Mississippian centers. It occupies a bluff above the Black Warrior River, and at its height between roughly 900 and 700 years ago, it contained more than 20 platform mounds arranged around a large central plaza housing a population that may have been the largest concentration of people in North America after Cahokia itself. The mounds are precisely arranged. The plaza they surround is a defined ceremonial space whose orientation encodes solar alignments. The artifacts recovered from Moundville's mounds and from the cemeteries associated with the site represent some of the finest examples of Mississippian art ever found, including copper plates, ceramic vessels, and stone palettes decorated with the iconography of the southeastern ceremonial complex. The imagery on Moundville's artifacts tells a cosmological story. The motifs that appear most frequently, the hand and eye, the feathered serpent, the bilobed arrow, the skull and crossbones, the falcon dancer, represent a shared symbolic vocabulary that appears across the entire Mississippian world, from Oklahoma to Virginia, from Wisconsin to Florida. Researchers who have spent careers working with this iconography have identified what appears to be a coherent cosmological system underlying it, a system in which the universe is organized into three tiers: an upper world of the sun, the thunderbirds, and the powers of order, a lower world of the underwater panthers, the horned serpents, and the powers of chaos and fertility, and the middle world of human habitation, which is maintained in balance through the ceremonies that negotiate the relationship between the upper and lower worlds. This three-tiered cosmology, and the specific beings that populate each tier, appear not only in the Mississippian artistic tradition, but also in the oral traditions of virtually every indigenous nation in eastern North America, whose traditions have been documented. The details vary from nation to nation, from region to region. But the underlying structure, the organization of the cosmos into above and below with the human world in the middle, maintained by ceremony and threatened when the balance between the powers tips in either direction, is remarkably consistent across an enormous range of cultures and time periods. This consistency suggests that the cosmological framework is genuinely ancient, a shared inheritance from some common ancestral tradition that predates the cultural differentiation of Eastern North American peoples into their historically documented forms. The archaeological evidence at Moundville supports the idea that the ceremonial center served not just the local community, but a much wider region. The scale of the mound construction and the volume of the artifact assemblage found there imply a concentration of labor and material that could only have been drawn from a large hinterland. People came to Moundville on pilgrimage, on trading expeditions, for ceremonies that drew participants from across the Black Warrior River basin and beyond. The site functioned as a sacred center for a region, a place whose cosmological significance organized the spiritual and social lives of communities that may never have spent more than a few days at the center itself. When Moundville declined, as Cahokia had declined, and as every major Mississippian center eventually declined, the communities of its hinterland did not disappear. They reorganized. The platform mounds of the great centers may have been abandoned, but the knowledge systems, the ceremonial calendars, the cosmological frameworks, and the social structures that had organized life around those centers survived in the communities that were their inheritors. The Creek Confederacy that flourished in the 18th century in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida represented one kind of reorganization after the decline of the major Mississippian centers. The Cherokee Nation of the Southern Appalachians represented another. The Choctaw and Chickasaw nations of Mississippi and Tennessee represented others. Each of these nations maintained, in changed and adapted forms, the institutional and cosmological legacy of the mound-building tradition. Which brings us to something that needs to be said directly about the history of how these places have been treated in the period since European contact. The mystery of America's most mysterious places is not only a scientific or archaeological mystery. It is also a political mystery, a mystery about what knowledge has been suppressed, what history has been erased, what voices have been silenced in the process of constructing the dominant narrative of American prehistory. The systematic demolition of indigenous sites in the name of agricultural development, urban expansion, and the collection of artifacts for private and institutional collections is not a thing of the distant past. It continued throughout the 20th century. It continues, at a reduced rate, today. The story of Etowah Mounds in Georgia illustrates both the survival and the damage. Etowah is one of the largest and best preserved Mississippian sites in the southeast, a three-mound complex on the Etowah River that was occupied for roughly 500 years during the Mississippian period. The principal mound, a platform mound of considerable size, still stands to its original height because Etowah was purchased for preservation in the early 20th century before it suffered the degree of damage that destroyed many comparable sites. But the site had already been excavated and reworked in the 19th century by an investigation that removed human remains and artifacts in quantities that would not be permitted today. The artifacts from Etowah that ended up in museum collections around the country represent an irreplaceable sample of Mississippian art: copper plates with the falcon dancer motif, marble effigy figures of a male and female pair that are among the most powerful and moving pieces of indigenous American sculpture ever found, ceramic vessels of extraordinary technical and artistic quality. These objects were made by people for specific purposes. The marble effigies were almost certainly associated with the most important burial contexts at Etowah, figures of authority or ancestors whose presence in the mortuary complex conferred legitimacy on the people buried with them. When they were removed from their original context, that meaning was partly disrupted. The objects survive. The context that gave them their full meaning was destroyed in the act of removing them. This is the fundamental tension in the history of North American archaeology. The desire to understand and preserve the material record of ancient cultures has often been expressed in ways that violated the integrity of that record and that violated the rights and the grief of the descendant communities. The shift toward collaborative and community-controlled archaeology that has been underway since the 1990s represents a genuine attempt to address this history, not by pretending it did not happen, but by changing the practice going forward. The results, as mentioned earlier, have been scientifically productive as well as ethically necessary. What the scientific results are showing is that the history being told about these places was impoverished, not just because of the techniques that earlier researchers used, but because of the fundamental orientation. Looking at indigenous sites as puzzles to be solved by outside expertise, rather than as places with living connections to living communities who could contribute essential knowledge to the understanding of them. There is a place in Utah that illustrates this principle with particular force. Range Creek Canyon in the Book Cliffs of eastern Utah was one of the best-kept secrets in American archaeology for most of the 20th century. A ranching family named Wilcox had owned the canyon for decades and had maintained a strict policy of no visitors, no archaeologists, no attention of any kind to the hundreds of archaeological sites that the canyon walls and floors contained. When the family finally sold the land to the state of Utah in 2004, archaeologists who gained access for the first time were stunned. The canyon was essentially pristine. Pit houses from the Fremont culture, which occupied the Colorado Plateau between roughly 1300 and 700 years ago, were still standing with their original contents undisturbed. Granaries packed with corn were perched in cliff alcoves where no casual visitor could reach them. Petroglyph panels covered long stretches of cliff face. The canyon was a time capsule, and it has been producing research at an extraordinary rate in the 2 decades since its opening, each season of excavation adding to the picture of Fremont life. What the Fremont left behind at Range Creek is not itself mysterious in the sense of being inexplicable, but it is deeply illuminating. The granaries tell a story of organized food storage that implies a settled or semi-settled lifestyle, more elaborate than the mobile foraging that earlier researchers assumed the Fremont practiced. The petroglyph panels tell a story of symbolic communication whose full content cannot be read, but whose organization and elaboration imply a complex visual language. The pit houses tell a story of domestic life organized around specific space divisions, specific hearth arrangements, specific material culture patterns that connect the Fremont to the broader ancestral Pueblo tradition, while also showing the ways they diverged from it. The Fremont are something of a puzzle in southwestern archaeology. They occupied the eastern Colorado Plateau, the Wasatch Front, and the Great Basin Fringe for roughly 600 years, practicing a mixed economy that combined corn, beans, and squash farming in the valley bottoms with hunting and foraging across the surrounding landscape. They made a distinctive grey ware pottery, built pit houses and small above-ground masonry structures, and produced a rock art tradition that is immediately recognizable. Large, shield-shaped anthropomorphic figures with trapezoidal bodies, often decorated with elaborate necklaces, headdresses, and other ornamentation, arranged in rows on cliff faces or in isolated positions on prominent boulders. These figures have a presence that visitors consistently describe as compelling, even overwhelming. They occupy the landscape with an authority that suggests they were not merely decorative, but were intended to assert a kind of claim on the places where they were made. The Fremont disappeared from the archaeological record around 700 years ago, at roughly the same time that the ancestral Pueblo traditions of the Four Corners region also declined and reorganized. The connection between the two collapses is not clear, but the timing is suggestive, and the agent of disruption that appears in the tree rings for that period is unmistakable, a prolonged, severe drought that would have stressed agricultural communities across the entire Colorado Plateau. Some Fremont populations may have reorganized as non-farming foragers and merged over time into the Great Basin and plains cultures of the region. Others may have moved south and contributed to the population movements that reshaped the Rio Grande Valley in the 13th and 14th centuries. The specific trajectory is not documented, but the knowledge that the Fremont brought to whatever they became next was not lost, it was transformed, as knowledge always is when it passes from one generation to the next, through changed circumstances. The Great Basin itself, the vast inland drainage between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada, is a landscape that often gets treated as an afterthought in discussions of pre-Columbian American complexity. The cultures of the basin, organized as small foraging bands moving across an arid landscape in pursuit of seasonal resources, appear simple beside the mound builders and the canyon pueblos. But this appearance is deceptive, as it is in so many cases in North American prehistory. The ecological knowledge required to subsist in the Great Basin with the technology available to its inhabitants was extraordinarily sophisticated. The plants, the water sources, the animal populations, the seasonal movements, the microclimatic variations that determined where food would be available in any given year. Knowing all of this and applying it successfully to keep communities fed and healthy over generations required a science of the environment as rigorous as any that was being practiced anywhere in the world. The pinyon pine was the anchor of Great Basin economy. Its nuts, harvested in the fall, provided a storable, nutritious food source that could sustain communities through the lean months of winter. The management of pinyon groves, the careful burning of understory to promote nut production, the organization of harvest camps and storage facilities, the trade in pinyon nuts across the basin and with neighboring peoples, all of this was organized with a sophistication that only becomes apparent when researchers begin looking carefully at the ecology and the oral traditions together. The pinyon juniper woodland was not wild, it was managed. The Great Basin was not a trackless wasteland in which isolated bands struggled to survive. It was a landscape of trails, of named places, of seasonal camps and winter villages whose locations encoded millennia of ecological knowledge about where to be and when. The rock art of the Great Basin is among the most extensive and most varied in North America, covering canyon walls and boulders across the entire region in densities that suggest it accumulated over thousands of years of continuous human occupation. Some of the Great Basin's rock art is ancient, belonging to traditions whose precise dating is difficult, but whose stylistic characteristics suggest extreme age. The Coso Range in California contains one of the densest concentrations of petroglyphs in North America, covering the basalt boulders of the volcanic landscape with tens of thousands of images in a tradition that dates back at least 2,000 years and may be much older. The images include bighorn sheep in enormous numbers, alongside anthropomorphic figures, geometric designs, and other elements whose interpretation has occupied researchers for decades without producing consensus. The bighorn imagery is almost certainly connected to hunting magic, to ceremonies designed to bring hunters into contact with the sheep that were a primary food source in the Coso Range. But the specifics of what the ceremonies involved, what the images communicated, and what the long-term tradition meant to the people who maintained it over generations are questions that remain largely unanswered. The Mojave Desert, at the southwestern end of the Great Basin, contains a set of geoglyphs that stand apart from the more common rock art of the region and that rival, in their scale and their mystery, the famous Nazca lines of Peru. The Mojave geoglyphs, sometimes called the Blythe intaglios for the California town nearest to the most famous group, are figures made by scraping away the dark desert varnish of gravel and exposing the lighter soil beneath, creating images that are only fully visible from above. The most famous group near Blythe includes a large human figure, roughly 170 feet in length, alongside a smaller human figure and a four-legged animal. Other geoglyphs in the Mojave depict spiral forms, animal figures, and abstract geometric shapes. The human figures are associated in the oral traditions of the Mojave and Kekan peoples with the culture hero Mastamho, a being of the creation era whose deeds established the world order. The figures marked sacred ground, places where ceremonies took place that connected the living to the powers of the creation time. Dating the Mojave geoglyphs has been technically difficult, but recent research using optically stimulated luminescence dating on the exposed gravel surfaces has produced ages ranging from roughly 2,000 to nearly 10,000 years ago for different geoglyph groups. If the oldest dates are correct, some of the Mojave geoglyphs are among the oldest monumental art anywhere in the Americas. They predate the Nazca lines of Peru by several thousand years. They predate the mound-building traditions of the eastern woodlands. They reach back into a period of American prehistory that we know almost nothing about in terms of cultural expression. The comparison to Nazca is instructive beyond the visual similarity. The Nazca lines of Peru are often cited as one of the great mysteries of the ancient world, precisely because they are most clearly visible from above, and it is argued that the people who made them could not have seen their own work in its full form. The same argument applies, with less intensity, to the larger Mojave geoglyphs. The human figure near Blythe is visible in its entirety only from an altitude of several hundred feet or more. From the ground, a viewer standing near it can see portions of it but not the whole. Did the makers intend the figures to be seen from above, by the sky beings who inhabited the upper world of their cosmology? Were they making offerings to the sky, as the mound builders of the East made offerings to the earth? The questions are not answered, and may never be answered, but they are the right questions to ask. The Four Corners region, where the modern states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet at a single point, is one of the most archaeologically rich areas in North America. This is ancestral Pueblo country, the landscape that gave rise to the architectural traditions of Chaco, Mesa Verde, and dozens of other famous sites. But the ancestral Pueblo story, even in this best documented of American archaeological landscapes, keeps revealing surprises as new techniques are applied to the evidence that has been accumulating for a century and a half of systematic investigation. One of the most significant recent discoveries in the Four Corners region came not from excavation, but from the application of LiDAR and satellite imaging to areas between the well-known sites. The corridors between the major ancestral Pueblo centers, previously thought to be relatively uninhabited, have turned out to be full of features. Agricultural terracing, water management features, field systems, and small community sites crowd the landscape in ways that were simply invisible in the survey data collected before remote sensing became available. The population of the ancestral Pueblo world in its peak period was far larger than estimates based on the visible site distributions had suggested. The landscape was full of people, organized into communities of varying sizes from single-family homesteads to multi-room pueblos to the great house complexes of the Chacoan network, all connected by roads, by water systems, and by the shared ceremonial and material culture of the broader ancestral Pueblo tradition. The water management of the ancestral Pueblo world is one of its most impressive and least appreciated technological achievements. In a landscape that receives 10 to 15 inches of rain per year, most of it in 2 brief monsoon seasons, farming was not a matter of planting seeds and waiting for rain. It was an engineering challenge that required the construction and maintenance of systems for capturing, storing, and directing the limited water that fell on the high desert landscape. Check dams, small earthen or masonry structures built across seasonal stream channels, slowed the flow of runoff and deposited soil on their upstream sides, creating small agricultural terraces that collected both water and sediment. Reservoirs cut into bedrock or lined with stone collected runoff from bedrock catchments. Ditches directed water from seasonal flows to agricultural fields on lower terraces. The entire landscape was organized as a water harvesting system, and maintaining it required community-level cooperation and organization across generations. The Hohokam culture of the Arizona desert south of the ancestral Pueblo world took water management to an even more impressive scale. The Hohokam occupied the Sonoran Desert of south-central Arizona for roughly 1,500 years, from approximately the 1st century of the Common Era to the 15th century, and at the height of their development, they constructed an irrigation system in the Salt and Gila River basins that was the largest in North America and one of the largest in the pre-industrial world. The Hohokam Canal system extended for more than 500 miles of main canals and many more miles of distribution laterals, moving water from the rivers to agricultural fields, spread across hundreds of square miles of desert that would otherwise have been too dry for farming. At its peak, this system may have supported a population of 50,000 people or more in the Salt River Valley alone. The scale of the Hohokam Canal system is easier to appreciate in abstract terms than in concrete ones, but consider this. The main canal trunks of the Hohokam system were, in places, 40 or more feet wide and 15 or more feet deep. Moving that volume of earth with digging sticks and carrying baskets, which is what the Hohokam built with, required the organized labor of thousands of people over many generations. Maintaining the system once built, clearing the accumulating sediment, repairing the breaches caused by floods, extending the system as population grew and more land needed water, required the continuous investment of community labor that implies a social organization capable of obligating its members to collective work at a scale that rivals anything in the pre-Columbian Americas. The social organization that maintained the Hohokam Canal system is not entirely understood, but the archaeological evidence suggests a system of canals grouped into interconnected networks, each controlled by a specific community, with the communities responsible for maintaining their section of the system and with some mechanism for coordinating the management of the system as a whole. How that coordination worked, what authority backed it up, and how disputes about water rights were resolved are questions that the archaeological record can only partially answer. The canal system is there. The specific governance structure that built and maintained it has left only indirect traces in the site distributions, the architectural patterns, and the artifact distributions of the Hohokam world. The Hohokam also built ball courts. This is a detail that consistently startles researchers and visitors alike when they encounter it for the first time, because ball courts in the pre-Columbian world are most famously associated with Mesoamerica, with the elaborate ceremonial ball game played by the Maya and the Aztec and many other cultures of central and southern Mexico. And yet there are more than 200 documented ball courts in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona and northern Mexico, built in the same elongated oval form that characterizes the Mesoamerican courts, but often on a smaller scale and without the vertical playing walls of the most elaborate Mesoamerican examples. What were the Hohokam ball courts for? The most obvious hypothesis, that they were for some version of the Mesoamerican ball game, is supported by the finding at some Hohokam sites of rubber balls, which were imported from tropical Mesoamerica since no rubber-producing trees grow in the Sonoran Desert. But whether the Hohokam ball game was the same game played in Mesoamerica, whether it carried the same ceremonial and cosmological significance, whether the court served the same social functions of bringing dispersed communities together for inter-community competition and the ceremonies surrounding it, these questions remain open. What is not open is the connection between the Hohokam world and Mesoamerica that the ball courts imply. The Hohokam were not just vaguely influenced by Mesoamerican culture, they were in direct and sustained contact with it. The macaws imported to Chaco Canyon came through Hohokam territory. The copper bells found in Hohokam sites were manufactured in western Mexico. The turquoise that moved south into Mexico in enormous quantities passed through the Hohokam trading sphere. The Hohokam were not a peripheral culture. They were the northern frontier of a Mesoamerican world that extended far into what is now the United States. The site of Snaketown in the Salt River Valley, excavated twice in the 20th century and now part of the Gila River Indian community's preserved lands, was the center of the Hohokam world for much of its classical period. At its peak, Snaketown covered more than 300 acres and was occupied by a permanent population whose size researchers have debated, but which was certainly in the thousands. The site had multiple ball courts, a large number of residential compounds, and the material remains of a community that was the center of regional trade, ceremony, and political organization for the surrounding communities. And Snaketown was eventually abandoned, as virtually all the major Hohokam centers were in the early 15th century, in a collapse that parallels in timing and apparent cause the collapses of other southwestern traditions. The question of what ended the Hohokam, like the questions about what ended Chaco and Cahokia, has produced a substantial scientific literature. The evidence points toward a combination of factors: prolonged drought, flood events that destroyed sections of the canal system, and possibly social conflicts arising from the stress of resource scarcity. The tree ring record shows a series of severe droughts in the 14th and early 15th centuries that would have placed enormous pressure on irrigation-dependent agriculture. A major flood event is documented in the stratigraphic record at multiple Hohokam sites, evidently massive enough to have caused significant damage to the canal infrastructure. Whatever the specific sequence of events, by the mid-15th century the large Hohokam communities were gone. The descendants of the Hohokam reorganized into smaller communities, became the Akimel Oodam and the Tohono Oodam, and maintained their presence in the Sonoran Desert in changed but continuous form. The Great House at Casa Grande, one of the few Hohokam architectural monuments still standing in anything like its original form, preserves in its walls another of the region's astronomical alignments. Casa Grande is a 4-story adobe structure, the tallest pre-Columbian building surviving in North America and the first American archaeological site to receive federal protection in 1892. The thick walls of the structure contain circular holes that align with the solstice sunrise and sunset, and with the equinox sunrise. On the morning of the spring equinox, the rising sun shines directly through a hole in the upper story's western wall and illuminates a circular hole in the east wall at exactly the time of the equinox, a light show that researchers first documented in the 1970s and that continues to be observed on the equinox by visitors who gather before dawn to watch it. Casa Grande was built by the Hohokam, and its astronomical alignments belong to the same tradition of solar observation documented at Chaco, at Cahokia's Woodhenge, at Crystal River in Florida, at the Ohio Earthworks. The same sun, the same sky, the same calendar encoded in different materials in different places by different peoples who were connected across the continent in ways that made a shared astronomical tradition possible. Casa Grande is the southernmost anchor of this tradition in what is now the United States, pointing toward the Mesoamerican astronomical science that influenced it, and that it in turn influenced in whatever exchanges moved along the trade routes between the Sonoran Desert and the Valley of Mexico. Now consider what all of this looks like from above, not from an airplane or a satellite, but from the perspective of the historical narrative. What emerges from even this incomplete survey of American mysterious places is not a collection of isolated anomalies, sites that are puzzling because they exceed what we expected of pre-Columbian cultures. What emerges is a pattern, a continental pattern of connected complexity, of shared astronomical knowledge, of sophisticated engineering, of long-distance communication and exchange, that persisted across thousands of years and expressed itself in dozens of distinct regional traditions while maintaining coherence at the continental scale. The pattern has been visible in the evidence for decades. Researchers who worked on different parts of it knew about each other's findings. But the synthesis, the picture of the whole, has been slow to emerge because the institutional structures of American archaeology were organized around regional specializations, around the study of specific cultures and specific periods by specialists who did not always talk to each other across the disciplinary divides. A southwestern archaeologist studying Chaco and an Ohio archaeologist studying the Hopewell Mounds were both finding astronomical alignments in their sites. But the conversation between them about what that might mean for a continental-level interpretation of pre-Columbian North America was not a regular feature of either field until relatively recently. The convergence that is now happening, the synthesis that is emerging from comparative work across these regional traditions, is what is producing the findings that researchers are describing as shocking. Not because any single piece of evidence is entirely new, but because the accumulation and comparison of evidence across the continent is producing a picture that is qualitatively different from anything that any regional study could have produced on its own. The picture that is emerging is of a continent that was, in the millennia before European contact, organized by networks of extraordinary reach and sophistication, sustained by shared cosmological frameworks of great antiquity, and producing at multiple times and places social and cultural achievements of a scale and complexity that require us to fundamentally revise our understanding of what pre-Columbian North American civilization was. The word civilization is worth pausing on. It has historically been used in ways that encoded specific assumptions about what counts as civilized: cities, writing, state government, monotheism, specific kinds of monumental architecture. These assumptions were developed in the context of European historical experience and were applied to the Americas as a standard against which indigenous cultures were measured and found wanting. The measurement was circular, and the standard was provincial, designed to produce the result it produced. The conclusion that the Americas, before European contact, were largely uncivilized, and therefore available for the civilizing project of colonization. But the evidence does not support this conclusion. The evidence supports a different conclusion entirely. The Americas, before European contact, were home to civilizations in any meaningful sense of that term: large-scale social organization, sophisticated knowledge systems, monumental architecture, long-distance communication and exchange, complex cosmological traditions, and political institutions capable of organizing collective action across enormous geographic areas and long spans of time. These civilizations were different from the civilizations of Europe, Africa, and Asia. They were organized differently, they were built on different principles, and they expressed their sophistication in different material forms. But they were not less sophisticated, not less complex, not less worthy of the respect and attention that the word civilization is supposed to convey. The reason this matters is not primarily historical. It is also present tense. The descendants of the civilizations described in this story are alive. They are citizens of the United States and Canada and Mexico. They maintain, in various states of vitality and continuity, the cultural traditions, the languages, the ceremonial practices, and the ecological knowledge systems that their ancestors developed and transmitted across the generations. What they inherited from those ancestors is not a collection of curiosities or a museum of primitive techniques. It is a body of knowledge and practice whose sophistication is only now beginning to be appreciated by the non-indigenous world, and whose relevance to pressing contemporary problems, from ecological management to political organization to community health, is increasingly recognized by researchers across multiple disciplines. The mysterious places of America are mysterious partly because we have been taught to see them through a framework that obscures their meaning. They are mysterious in the way that a text in an unknown language is mysterious. The information is there, the structure is there, the meaning is encoded in the forms, but without the key to the code, what is visible seems inexplicable or miraculous, rather than being the expression of a coherent and sophisticated system. The key to the code is not primarily a matter of archaeological technique, though archaeological technique has contributed enormously to our current understanding. The key to the code is the knowledge held by the descendants of the people who built these places, a knowledge that is partial, that has been damaged by centuries of suppression and disruption, but that is real, and that is recoverable in collaboration with those who hold it. What is being recovered, in those collaborations, is not just the meaning of specific sites. It is a way of understanding the relationship between human communities and the landscapes they inhabit, a relationship that was cultivated and refined over thousands of years in North America, and that produced results whose sustainability and sophistication we are only beginning to comprehend. The managed landscapes, the water systems, the astronomical calendars, the political institutions, all of these were not ends in themselves, but expressions of a philosophy of human life that placed the community in relationship with the natural world, the ancestors, and the descendants in a framework of responsibility and reciprocity that extended across time in both directions. That philosophy has survived. It persists in the ceremonies that still take place at the surviving sacred sites, in the oral traditions that still carry the knowledge of what happened at the abandoned sites, in the political and legal arguments that indigenous nations make about their rights to their ancestral lands and waters, and in the growing body of research that is confirming, in the language of contemporary science, the depth and the substance of what indigenous peoples have been saying about their history and their relationship to this continent for as long as anyone has been listening. There is a place in the Black Hills of South Dakota where the rock speaks in a different way than the rock at Chaco or the rock of the Ohio Valley. Bear Butte, called Matopaha in Lakota, rises as an isolated laccolith above the surrounding plains, a geologic anomaly that stands alone against the sky, visible for many miles in all directions. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and numerous other plains peoples, Bear Butte is not simply a mountain. It is one of the most sacred sites in the world, a place of vision questing and prayer that has been used for ceremonies of the deepest significance for generations, stretching back beyond the reach of any historical documentation. The prayers left on its slopes, bundles of cloth and tobacco tied to the branches of trees, accumulate over years, visible evidence of an ongoing relationship between the human community and this particular place that is not interrupted by the seasons or by the political changes of the world below. The plains peoples whose ceremonies center on Bear Butte and on similar sacred topographic features across the Great Plains are sometimes imagined as recent arrivals to the landscape they inhabit, nomadic hunters who moved onto the plains in force only after the introduction of the horse in the 17th and 18th centuries. This imagination is wrong. The horse did transform plains life, dramatically and quickly, in ways that reshaped the demographics and the social organization of the region. But people had been living on the Great Plains for thousands of years before the horse arrived, exploiting the vast bison herds by foot hunting, using sophisticated drive techniques to channel bison over cliffs and into enclosures, maintaining seasonal round economies that balanced hunting with the gathering of plant foods and trading with the agricultural communities of the river valleys to the east and west. The evidence for this deep plains occupation is everywhere in the landscape, for those who know how to read it. The bison jumps, the sites where hunters drove bison herds over cliff edges to kill them in large numbers, occur across the northern plains and are among the most dramatic archaeological sites on the continent. Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump in Alberta, Canada, is the most famous and best studied, a site that was in use for nearly 6,000 years, its base deposit full of bison bones accumulated over generations of successful hunts. The organization required for a successful bison jump was considerable. Scouts to locate the herd and judge the wind and terrain, drivers arranged in lines extending back from the cliff edge to funnel the herd toward the killing site, people stationed at critical points to redirect straying animals, and the full community assembled at the base of the cliff to butcher and process the carcasses as rapidly as possible before scavengers and decomposition made the meat unusable. This kind of organized communal hunt was not improvised. It was the product of an ecological knowledge and a social coordination developed over generations, maintained through oral tradition and ceremony, and expressed in the landscape through the stone features, the stone alignments that guided the bison drives. Hundreds of these stone alignments, called drive lanes or buffalo pounds, depending on their configuration, survive across the northern plains. Some extend for miles, built by the accumulation of thousands of stones moved and placed over many generations. They are among the most labor-intensive prehistoric constructions on the plains, and they are among the least appreciated, partly because they are in remote areas and partly because they look, to the uninitiated, like natural rock concentrations rather than the engineered structures they are. The medicine wheels of the northern plains are another category of archaeological mystery that has received attention but not consensus interpretation. These are circular arrangements of stones, sometimes with radiating spokes extending from a central hub that appear across Wyoming, Montana, and adjacent areas of Canada. The most famous, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel, high in the Wyoming mountains at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, consists of a stone circle about 80 feet in diameter, with 28 spokes radiating from a central cairn, and 5 additional cairns arranged around the perimeter. The wheel's spokes and cairns align with the rising points of specific bright stars at the summer solstice, including Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, as well as with the summer solstice sunrise itself. The Bighorn medicine wheel has been dated to roughly 600 years ago, though it may incorporate an older core feature at its center. But the cairn alignments with the stellar risings are not accidental. The probability that multiple star alignments would occur by chance in a single structure has been calculated by archaeoastronomers as essentially nil. Someone at the site, 600 or more years ago, had the knowledge to design an astronomical instrument at this location, in these proportions, to capture these specific stellar events. That knowledge was not invented at the moment of construction. It was the product of a long tradition of sky observation and stellar calendar keeping that must have roots reaching back centuries or millennia before the wheel itself was built. Medicine wheels appear to have served as astronomical calendars, as sacred ceremonial spaces, and possibly as sites where multiple different nations or bands could gather for trade and ceremony in the relatively brief summer months when the high-altitude location was accessible. The number 28, represented by the spokes of the Bighorn wheel, recurs in Plains ceremonial and calendrical contexts in ways that suggest a connection to the lunar month, which is approximately 28 days long. The medicine wheel may have encoded both solar and lunar time, a calendar in stone that allowed those who knew how to read it to track the seasonal cycle and the lunar cycle simultaneously. The Great Plains were not a simple landscape of buffalo and grass. They were a complex world organized around detailed ecological knowledge, ceremonial calendars, long-distance trade, and sophisticated social institutions that managed the challenges of life in an environment of dramatic climatic variability. The cycles of drought that have characterized the plains climate for thousands of years presented regular existential challenges to the communities that depended on the bison herds and the plant foods of the grassland. Communities that survived those cycles did so because they had developed adaptive strategies, including the maintenance of relationships with neighboring peoples that allowed them to move toward areas of relative plenty during lean years and to trade for food when their own resources failed. The social networks of the plains, maintained through ceremony, through marriage alliance, and through trade gatherings, were not luxury institutions. They were survival infrastructure. The trade gatherings of the plains were extraordinary events. Before the horse, they were anchored to specific geographic locations where different ecological zones met and where multiple peoples converged annually or semi-annually to exchange goods, conduct ceremonies, arrange marriages, and maintain the relationships that held the broader social world together. The Shoshone rendezvous tradition, documented in the early 19th century but rooted in much older practice, brought together peoples from across the northern Rockies and adjacent plains for annual summer gatherings of trade and ceremony. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages at the confluence of the Knife and Missouri rivers in what is now North Dakota functioned as the great trading center of the northern plains for centuries, a node in a network that connected the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes, the Great Plains, and the upper Missouri Valley in a web of exchange that moved copper, shells, obsidian, dentalium, and dozens of other materials across the continent along routes that have been partially traced in the artifact distributions of archaeological sites from Alberta to Louisiana. The Mandan themselves are one of the most remarkable peoples in the ethnographic record of the Northern Plains. When Lewis and Clark wintered with them in 1804 and 1805, they encountered a people of considerable sophistication, permanent village dwellers living in large earth lodges organized in a densely settled community, farmers who grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in the bottomlands of the Missouri River, and who maintained the most important trade center on the upper Missouri, a place where every other people of the region came to exchange. The Mandan ceremonies, particularly the Okipa ceremony that was documented in extraordinary detail by the painter George Catlin in 1832, represented one of the most elaborate ritual complexes documented in North American ethnography, a multi-day renewal ceremony whose symbolic content drew on the deepest cosmological frameworks of the Plains tradition and whose social function was to renew the community's covenant with the powers that sustained it. The Mandan were nearly destroyed by the smallpox epidemic of 1837, which killed an estimated 90% of their people in a matter of weeks, reducing a population of perhaps 1,500 people to fewer than 150 survivors. What was lost in that catastrophe, in terms of knowledge, of ceremonial tradition, of ecological and historical memory, is beyond calculation. The survivors, together with the Hidatsa and later with the Arikara, formed what became the three affiliated tribes of the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. They have maintained what could be maintained of their traditions, including fragments of the Okipa ceremony and the oral traditions that encode the cosmological framework it expressed. The story of the smallpox epidemic of 1837 is in some ways a microcosm of the larger story of what European contact did to the indigenous civilizations of North America. Not through military conquest alone, which was real and devastating, but through biological catastrophe on a scale that has no parallel in documented human history. The estimate that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century and a half after 1492 is now widely accepted by demographic historians. This means that when European explorers and settlers were recording their observations of indigenous North America in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were looking at a world that had already been through a Holocaust, that had already lost the vast majority of its people, that was in the process of reorganizing from the shock of a depopulation so severe that its effects on landscapes and institutions and knowledge systems were still unfolding. Understanding this is essential for understanding what has been lost and why the recovery of it is both important and difficult. The mound sites that puzzled 19th century observers were puzzling partly because the communities that had built them and that held the knowledge of what they meant had been devastated by disease before any systematic attempt to document that knowledge was made. The agricultural systems that had supported large populations were in various stages of collapse or transformation when European observers arrived. The trade networks that had connected the continent were disrupted or destroyed. The political institutions that had organized large-scale social cooperation were weakened or gone. What observers saw, and what they recorded, was a shadow of what had existed, and they interpreted that shadow through frameworks that could not accommodate its depth and complexity, even when they tried to engage with it fairly. The recovery of pre-Columbian American history is therefore not simply an archaeological project. It is also a project of listening to the communities that survived the catastrophe, that maintained what they could of their knowledge systems through the most difficult centuries, and that are now, in conditions of somewhat greater security and somewhat greater respect for their rights and their knowledge, articulating what they know about their past in ways that the broader public and the scholarly community are increasingly able to hear. What they are saying, in ceremony and in scholarship, in museum exhibitions and in legal arguments, in environmental management plans and in oral history projects, is consistent with, and in many cases, ahead of what the archaeology is finding, that the pre-Columbian Americas were more complex, more connected, and more sophisticated than the dominant narrative has acknowledged, and that the descendants of its builders are the appropriate custodians of the knowledge required to understand it. Recent years have brought specific, dramatic instances of this kind of knowledge contributing to scientific understanding in ways that generated significant media attention. The discovery of a massive ancient canal network in the Amazon basin, made possible by LiDAR surveys of the forest floor after deforestation exposed the underlying topography, revealed a landscape that had been densely inhabited and intensively managed by a large pre-Columbian population. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon had been saying for generations that their ancestors had created the terra preta soils, the dark, fertile, human-created soils that appear in patches across the Amazon basin and that are among the most productive agricultural soils in the tropics. Archaeologists had disputed this for decades, arguing that the soils were natural features. The evidence now makes clear that terra preta is anthropogenic, a product of centuries of deliberate soil amendment by pre-Columbian Amazonian peoples, and the knowledge of how to create it is encoded in the oral traditions of contemporary Amazonian indigenous communities. In North America, a parallel story is unfolding around the recognition of indigenous knowledge systems in fields ranging from ecological management to medical research to climate science. The traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples about the specific plants, animals, water systems, and climatic patterns of their ancestral territories is being recognized by scientists as a dataset of extraordinary richness that complements and in some cases, significantly enriches what instrumental monitoring and academic research have produced. Long-term observations of wildlife populations, phenological changes in plant communities, shifts in the behavior of rivers and streams, all of this has been accumulated in oral and ceremonial traditions over generations, and is only now being systematically documented and incorporated into scientific databases. The implications of this for understanding the most mysterious places of America are profound. These sites were not built and then abandoned to mystery. They were built within living knowledge, traditions that have, in many cases, survived the centuries of disruption and suppression that intervened between their construction and the present day. The mystery that surrounds them is partly a function of the distance between those traditions and the researchers who have been studying the sites without access to them. That distance is closing. It is closing through collaboration, through mutual respect, through the slow and sometimes painful process of building the trust necessary for genuine intellectual exchange across the enormous cultural and historical divides that separate contemporary indigenous communities from the institutions of academic archaeology. What is being produced by that closing distance is not just better archaeology, though it is certainly that. It is a new narrative of the American past, one that is more complete, more accurate, and more morally coherent than what came before it. A narrative in which the people who built Cahokia and the Hopewell Mounds and the Chacoan Great Houses and the Hohokam Canals and the Serpent Effigies and the Medicine Wheels are recognized as the sophisticated, knowledge-rich, socially complex civilizations they were. A narrative in which the continent that European explorers arrived in was not empty or simple or primitive, but was a world of extraordinary human achievement, accumulated over tens of thousands of years of continuous occupation and cultural development. And a narrative in which the catastrophe of European contact is understood not as the replacement of a lesser civilization by a superior one, but as the destruction and disruption of one of the great human civilizational experiments by disease, violence, and the particular combination of political and economic forces that drove European expansion. The technology that is now being brought to bear on North American mysterious places is accelerating the pace of discovery in ways that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. LiDAR, as discussed, has transformed the ability to see buried and vegetated features. Ground-penetrating radar is revealing subsurface structures at known sites whose full extent was previously unknown. Satellite multispectral imaging is identifying crop marks and soil anomalies that betray the presence of buried features across landscapes too large to survey by any ground-level method. Magnetometry and electrical resistance surveys are mapping the signatures of ancient hearths, pits, walls, and compacted surfaces without a single shovelful of earth being moved. Isotopic analysis of human remains and artifacts is revealing origins, diets, and movement patterns, with a specificity that transforms understanding of how ancient communities lived and how they were connected to distant places. The integration of all these techniques with the ancient DNA revolution is producing what researchers describe as a golden age of pre-Columbian American archaeology. More has been learned about the human past of this continent in the last 20 years than in the previous 100, and the pace is accelerating rather than slowing. The databases of ancient genomes, ancient dietary information, ancient climatic records, and ancient artifact distributions are expanding every year, and the computational tools available to analyze them and identify patterns across them are becoming more powerful with every new generation of hardware and software. What is emerging from this golden age is a detailed picture of specific places and specific moments that fills in the broad outlines of the story that the earlier evidence had suggested. The founding of Chaco, the specific sequence of great house construction and road building and outlier establishment that created the Chacoan system over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, is now understood in more detail than ever before, with tree-ring dates from timbers used in construction, providing year-by-year chronologies of specific building episodes. The collapse of Chaco and the migration of its population into the Rio Grande Valley in the 12th and 13th centuries can be traced in the genetic record of modern Pueblo peoples. whose ancestral DNA connects them directly to the builders of the Chacoan great houses. The specific events that ended Cahokia, previously obscure, are beginning to come into focus through a combination of tree ring climate records, stratigraphic evidence of flood damage, isotopic evidence of nutritional stress in human remains, and ancient DNA evidence of population decline and displacement. The picture that is emerging suggests not a single catastrophic event, but a slow unraveling over several generations as the combination of climate deterioration, resource depletion, and social conflict progressively undermined the institutional structures that had held the Cahokian system together. The people who left Cahokia did not disappear. They reorganized into the smaller, more dispersed, but still sophisticated communities that the French encountered when they arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the late 17th century. The timing of these collapses and the patterns of reorganization that followed them are themselves illuminating. The 12th and 13th centuries were a period of climatic stress across the entire northern hemisphere, a prolonged period of drought and instability that followed the medieval warm period and preceded the more severe disruptions of the Little Ice Age. The same centuries that saw the collapse of Chaco and the stress on Cahokia also saw the disruption of other complex societies across the globe, the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, the disruptions in Mongol-controlled China, the famines that hit medieval Europe. Climate instability did not cause the collapse of complex societies automatically or universally, but it placed enormous stress on social systems whose complexity had been developed in the context of better conditions, and those systems whose organizational structures were not flexible enough to adapt to reduced resources tended to fail. The reorganizations that followed the collapses of the 12th through 15th centuries in North America were not simply the disappearance of complexity. They were transformations in which the knowledge and institutions of the collapsed systems were carried forward in changed forms by communities that were more dispersed and in some ways less centralized, but no less sophisticated. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley that emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries were organized around a different model than the centralized Chacoan system, one in which the community-level pueblo was the primary institutional unit rather than the regional ceremonial center. But the astronomical knowledge, the ceremonial traditions, the water management practices, the ceramic traditions, the social structures, all of these were continuous with what had gone before. Chaco did not die. It transformed. The same is true of the traditions of the southeast after the decline of Cahokia, of the southwest after the reorganization of the ancestral Pueblo world, of the Great Basin after the transformation of the Fremont tradition, of the Great Plains after the demographic disruptions of the contact period. Transformation is not extinction. The knowledge survived. The people survived. The traditions survived, damaged and changed, but identifiably continuous with what they had been before the catastrophes that nearly ended them. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the mysterious places of America and about the civilizations that built them. They are not mysteries in the sense of being inexplicable or alien or beyond the reach of human understanding. They are mysteries in the sense that a locked room is a mystery when you have the wrong key. The meaning is there, entirely accessible in principle, but unavailable to the person approaching it with the wrong framework and the wrong tools. The right framework is available. It is held by the descendant communities of the people who built these places, maintained in oral traditions and ceremonial practices that are older than the oldest written records in the Western Hemisphere. The right tools are also becoming available in the form of the technological revolution in remote sensing, dating, genetic analysis, and computational archaeology that is transforming the field. And the combination of indigenous knowledge and contemporary science, when it is pursued with mutual respect and genuine intellectual seriousness, is producing results of a quality and a significance that neither tradition could produce alone. What we are finding at the most mysterious places in America is ourselves. Not in the sense that the civilizations of pre-Columbian North America were like us in their specific cultural forms, because they were not. They were genuinely different in their organization, their philosophy, their relationship to the natural world, and their understanding of the human place in the cosmos. But they were like us in the fundamental ways that matter most, in their curiosity, in their ambition, in their capacity for social organization and knowledge production, In their desire to understand the sky and the earth and the passage of time, in their love for their children and their dead, in their impulse to make beautiful things and to inscribe meaning on the landscape, they were fully human. And the evidence of their full humanity is written in the earthworks and the mounds, the roads and the canals, the cliff dwellings and the painted caves, the astronomical alignments and the traded goods, that their descendants maintain as sacred places and that their neighbors are only now beginning to read. Consider what has been found in just the last decade. In Louisiana, LiDAR surveys have revealed dozens of previously unknown earthwork sites in areas that were thought to have been thoroughly surveyed, extending the known distribution of the Poverty Point cultural tradition into new regions and suggesting a population density in the lower Mississippi Valley 3,000 years ago that was far higher than any previous estimate. In Georgia, satellite imaging has identified what appear to be extensive agricultural field systems associated with Mississippian period sites, invisible from the ground and never previously documented, that suggest the agricultural foundations of Mississippian civilization were far more extensive and more systematically organized than anyone had suspected. In Texas, the discovery and excavation of the Deborah L. Friedkin site and related sites along Buttermilk Creek has pushed the documented date of human presence in central Texas back to at least 16,000 years ago, into the same pre-Clovis range as Meadowcroft and Monteverde, and the artifacts recovered are unlike anything in the Clovis toolkit, suggesting a completely separate technological tradition of great age. In the Pacific Northwest, collaborative research between archaeologists and Coast Salish First Nations has documented a series of intertidal fish weirs along the coastlines of British Columbia and Washington that are, in some cases, more than 1,000 years old, and that represent some of the most sophisticated fish harvesting infrastructure ever identified in the pre-Columbian world. These weirs are not passive traps but active management systems that were maintained and modified over generations to optimize the harvest of specific species at specific seasons while allowing enough fish to pass through to maintain the populations on which future harvests depended. They are, in other words, examples of sustainable fisheries management that was working effectively when European observers arrived and that could work effectively today if it were given the institutional support. In the Great Lakes region, the ongoing analysis of ancient DNA from Hopewell period burials is producing findings that reshape the understanding of who participated in the Hopewell interaction sphere and how the sphere was maintained. The genetic diversity of the individuals buried at major Hopewell ceremonial sites is greater than would be expected from a purely local population, confirming that the Hopewell gatherings brought people from across a vast geographic area together in the same places, and that some of those people became part of local communities through marriage and residence. The Hopewell system was not just a trading network. It was a social world in which the boundaries between peoples were regularly crossed through the most fundamental of human institutions: love, marriage, and family. And in the Southwest, the integration of tree ring climate data with the ancient DNA record and the ceramic chronologies of Chacoan expansion and collapse is producing a detailed narrative of how the Chacoan system responded to climate variability over its 3-century existence. In the warm and relatively wet decades of the 10th and early 11th centuries, the system expanded rapidly, with new outlier communities being established across an enormous area and the road network extending to its greatest extent. In the drier and more variable decades of the mid-11th century, expansion slowed and the internal organization of the canyon intensified, with the great houses growing taller and the kiva systems becoming more elaborate. In the catastrophically dry years of the late 11th and 12th centuries, the system began to contract. The outlier communities were abandoned one by one, and the population of the canyon itself declined as people moved to better watered locations. The collapse was not sudden. It was a managed retreat over several generations, and the knowledge it preserved was the knowledge that allowed the successor communities of the Rio Grande to flourish. Every one of these findings, and the dozens more being produced every year by archaeologists working across the continent, adds texture and depth to the picture of pre-Columbian North America. Each finding in isolation would be significant. Together, They constitute a revolution in understanding, a complete overhaul of the story of this continent's human past that is comparable in its scope and its implications to any major scientific revolution of the last century. The revolution is not complete. It will not be complete for many decades, perhaps for centuries, because the archaeological record of North America is vast, and only a tiny fraction of it has been examined with modern methods. The number of sites awaiting discovery, the number of known sites awaiting full investigation, the number of investigated sites whose data has not yet been fully analyzed and interpreted is enormous. The funding available for archaeology is limited, and the time of trained researchers is finite. The pace of development that is destroying unexcavated sites is greater than the pace of investigation that is recovering their evidence. The race between discovery and destruction is a permanent feature of North American archaeology, and it is a race that the destruction is currently winning in many parts of the continent. But the trajectory of understanding is upward. The quality of the picture we have of pre-Columbian North America is better than it has ever been, and it is improving every year. The collaborations between indigenous communities and academic researchers are producing results that neither could produce alone. The technology is giving us eyes to see what was previously invisible. The ancient DNA is giving us voices from the past that we had no way to hear before. And the growing recognition in the broader culture that the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America deserve the same serious attention and respect that the civilizations of Europe and Asia and Africa have historically received is creating a public appetite for these findings that is supporting the research and demanding that its results be communicated clearly and honestly. The places themselves are still there. Not all of them. Many have been destroyed, and that loss is real and irreversible. But many of the most important are still there, protected in national parks, in tribal lands, in state preserves, and on private properties whose owners have chosen stewardship over development. Chaco Canyon is still there, its great house walls still standing, its astronomical alignments still activating on the solstice mornings, when the light falls through the precisely positioned doorways and illuminates the specific rooms that were built to receive it. The Newark earthworks are still there, though surrounded by a golf course and bisected by roads. Cahokia's mounds are still there, though the city that surrounded them has been replaced by a suburb of Street. Louis, the Serpent Mound is still there, coiling along its Ohio Ridge. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel is still there, high in its Wyoming mountains. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are still there, still legible, still speaking in their architectural language of precision and intention. And the people whose ancestors built these places are still there. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande and the Arizona Mesas, the Tohono O'odham and Akimel O'odham of the Sonoran Desert, the Ho-Chunk and Menominee and Potawatomi of the Great Lakes, the Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho of the Northern Plains, the Haudenosaunee of the northeastern woodlands, the Cherokee and Choctaw and Chickasaw and Muskogee of the southeast, the Tlingit and Haida and Coast Salish of the northwest, the Inuit and Yupik and Alutiiq of the Arctic and subarctic, hundreds of nations, each with its own language and its own traditions and its own connection to the landscape its ancestors shaped over thousands of years. They are there. They have always been there. And what they know about the most mysterious places in America is not a supplement to the scientific understanding of those places. It is, in many cases, the deepest and most essential knowledge available. The story of what scientists have found at America's most mysterious places is ultimately a story about the limits of science when it works alone, and about what becomes possible when it stops working alone. The sites have always been there. The alignments, the engineering, the trade goods, the artistic traditions, the astronomical encodings, all of it has been sitting in the landscape and in the ground, available to be read. What has changed in the last generation is the willingness to bring the full range of relevant knowledge to the reading, including the knowledge that was never absent but was long refused the attention it deserved, the knowledge held by the people who are the living continuation of the civilizations that built these extraordinary places. When that knowledge is brought together with the satellite imaging and the LiDAR, and the ancient DNA, and the isotopic analysis, and the high-resolution dating methods, and all the other tools of 21st century archaeology, what emerges is not a mystery. What emerges is a history. A history of this continent that is older, deeper, more complex, and more beautiful than anything that has previously been taught in any classroom or described in any textbook. A history that belongs to everyone who lives on this land and that connects the present to a past more ancient and more accomplished than most people have ever been allowed to imagine. The scientists who are finding these things are finding them in places that were never truly mysterious, only unread. And what they are finding, place by place and discovery by discovery and collaboration by collaboration, is the full story of what it means to be human on this continent. A story that begins not 500 years ago with the arrival of European ships, not 1,000 years ago with the height of Cahokia, not 5,000 years ago with the construction of Poverty Point, but somewhere in the deep past, 40 or 50 or 60,000 years ago, when the first people looked at this landscape and saw in it the possibility of everything that would follow. That possibility was realized. The evidence of its realization is everywhere around us, in the mounds and the earthworks, the roads and the canals, the cliff dwellings and the medicine wheels, the petroglyphs and the geoglyphs, the astronomical alignments and the managed landscapes and the continental trade networks. America's most mysterious places are not mysterious because they are inexplicable. They are mysterious because we are still learning to read them, still learning to hear the voices that built them, still learning to understand the civilization or the civilizations, the braided, complex, continent-spanning civilizations that they represent. That reading is happening right now in laboratories and field sites and archives and tribal offices and university seminar rooms and national park visitor centers and the private homes of elders who remember what their grandparents told them. The reading is happening. And what it is revealing, what scientists and scholars and indigenous knowledge holders are finding together at America's most mysterious places, is something that has the capacity to genuinely shock the world, not because it is alien or supernatural or inexplicable, but because it is human, fully, profoundly, magnificently human, in a way that the story told about this continent for the last 5 centuries has consistently failed to acknowledge. The places are speaking. The question is whether we are ready to listen. You have been here, listening through what must feel like an enormous stretch of time, moving across this continent from canyon to mound to cliff face to river bottom to Arctic shore and back again, and what that journey has covered is only a fraction of what is there. Every site mentioned here has depths that a single treatment cannot reach. Every culture touched on has more to say than any summary can contain. Every finding described here is the tip of a research iceberg, whose full mass extends down into years of work by hundreds of researchers and into the living knowledge of communities whose members have maintained what matters across centuries of extraordinary difficulty. If there is one thing to carry away from this journey through American mystery, it is this. The most important discoveries about these places have not yet been made. The most important collaborations between science and indigenous knowledge have not yet produced their most significant results. The most extraordinary findings from the satellite surveys and the ancient DNA databases and the LiDAR campaigns are still being analyzed and interpreted. The story of what is here, what was built here, what was known here, what was lived here across thousands of years of continuous human presence is a story whose telling is just beginning to hit its stride. And every time a new piece of it comes to light, in a journal article or a museum exhibition or a documentary or a ceremony conducted at a site that has been protected and respected as it deserves to be, the world of human history becomes a larger and richer place. The record of what our species is capable of gets longer. The evidence that human ambition, human curiosity, human social creativity, and human relationship with the natural world have always and everywhere exceeded the modest expectations of those who looked at the archaeological evidence with too small a framework gets stronger. The sun rises over the winter solstice alignment at Chaco Canyon every year on the shortest day of the year, just as it has for over 1,000 years. The spiral on Fajada Butte receives its dagger of light. The earthen owl at Newark catches the angle of the morning. The stone circle on the Wyoming mountaintop aligns its spokes with the midsummer stars. All of this happens whether we are watching or not, whether we understand it or not, whether we have done right by the people who built it or not. The alignments are patient. They are not going anywhere. And neither, it turns out, is the knowledge that gives them meaning. It was here before the current moment of recognition, carried through the difficult centuries in the minds and voices of the people who knew it. And now, as science finally turns its most powerful tools toward these places with respect and collaboration rather than extraction and assumption, that knowledge and that science are together producing something new, something that may prove to be among the most important intellectual developments of this century, a true history of this continent. Not the history of its most recent 500 years, but the history of its full human story. A story that is 50,000 years old, that is still being written, and that has barely begun to be read. Let that sit with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. Somewhere out there, under the sky that has not changed since the first people looked up at it from these same latitudes, the earthworks and the cliff dwellings and the medicine wheels and the astronomical alignments are doing what they were built to do, patient, precise, waiting for us to finish the long work of learning to see them clearly, waiting for us to complete the reading that generations of discoverers have begun, waiting for the moment when the full history of this place, in all its complexity and all its beauty, is finally held in minds big enough to contain it. We are getting there. That is what the scientists are finding, and it is worth more than any headline will ever be able to say. Rest now. The mounds are still there. The roads are still there. The stars are exactly where they were when the people who aligned their buildings and earthworks and medicine wheels to them first watched them rise. And somewhere in the knowledge that is still being kept, still being transmitted, still being told in ceremonies and in stories, and in the ongoing act of living in connection with this land, the full meaning of all of it is still alive. There is a canyon in southern Utah that most people have never heard of, and it holds one of the most dramatic collections of ancient rock art anywhere on the continent. Buckhorn Wash, tucked into a fold of the San Rafael Swell, displays panels of Barrier Canyon-style pictographs that have been dated to between 2,000 and 4,000 years old, and possibly older. The figures in the Barrier Canyon tradition are unlike anything else in the rock art record of North America. They are tall, elongated beings, sometimes reaching 6 or 8 feet in height on the canyon wall, painted in red and ochre pigments on the smooth sandstone. They have no legs, or only vestigial legs. They float. Their eyes, when depicted, are enormous, wide open, directed straight at the viewer. They sometimes have antennae, or horns, or headdresses that suggest transformation or supernatural status, and they are surrounded by smaller beings, animals, dots, lines, and abstract forms whose relationship to the central figures is clearly intended but not clearly understood. Researchers who have spent careers studying the Barrier Canyon style have proposed multiple interpretations. Shamanic practitioners in states of visionary trance, supernatural beings from the lower world, the realm of water and underground power that appears in so many southwestern cosmological traditions. Ancestors, rendered enormous to convey their importance relative to the living. Healing figures, connected to the ceremonies of spiritual medicine. Whatever they are not casual marks. They are executed with technical skill and intentional design. The pigments were mixed carefully and applied with controlled tools. The figures are composed in deliberate relationship to each other and to the features of the rock surface on which they are painted. Someone chose this canyon wall, in this particular quality of light at particular times of day, to place these beings in permanent form. And they placed them here in numbers, suggesting repeated visits over generations, as if the canyon was a specific kind of charged space where the work of painting these beings needed to happen. The Barrier Canyon style extends across the Colorado Plateau, appearing at dozens of sites over a broad geographic area, in a tradition whose internal coherence suggests it belonged to a specific cultural group or groups that maintained a shared ceremonial practice over a very long period. The style is old enough that it predates the ancestral Pueblo tradition and was made by people whose broader cultural identity remains unclear. They are not ancestral Pueblo. They are something older, something from the deep archaic period of the Colorado Plateau, people who inhabited this landscape before the introduction of agriculture and who developed a visual and ceremonial tradition of remarkable sophistication in the context of a mobile foraging lifestyle. That a mobile foraging people would develop a tradition of monumental rock painting is itself instructive, another instance of the repeated finding that social and intellectual complexity are not the exclusive property of agricultural societies with permanent settlements. The Barrier Canyon painters moved through the landscape on seasonal rounds, following game and plant foods across altitudinal zones, but they returned regularly and repeatedly to specific canyon sites where the conditions for painting were right and where the tradition of painting had established a kind of ongoing conversation with the supernatural world. The canyon walls were their temples, renewed and extended with each generation's contribution to the accumulating record. This is a pattern that appears across the rock art of North America. Specific sites used repeatedly over centuries or millennia, each generation adding its layer to an accumulating visual record whose earliest layers may date back to the very first human occupation of the region. At some sites, there are documented sequences of styles going back 10,000 years or more, each style superimposed on or placed alongside the earlier ones, creating a palimpsest of human presence that is literally written on the landscape in paint and pecking. These sites were not just canvases, they were archives. They were the places where the community's relationship with the supernatural world was maintained across time, where the knowledge encoded in the images was available to those who could read it, and where the act of adding to the record renewed the connection between the living community and all the generations that had contributed before them. The rock art of the Columbia River Plateau in what is now Oregon and Washington represents another tradition of extraordinary extent and complexity. The Plateau peoples, who lived in the rich environment created by the Columbia River system and its tributaries, developed a rock art tradition closely connected to their spiritual practices, particularly to the vision quest tradition, through which individuals sought to establish personal relationships with guardian spirits. The images in Columbia Plateau rock art are frequently the visual expressions of vision experiences, animal helpers, supernatural beings, power symbols, and abstract forms that represent the specific content of encounters with the spirit world that an individual had experienced during the intensely solitary ordeal of the vision quest. The vision quest itself is a tradition of extraordinary antiquity and wide distribution across North America. In its most general form, it involves a period of solitary isolation in a specific landscape, often a prominent geographic feature like a mountain peak or a cliff edge, combined with fasting, prayer, and heightened awareness, with the goal of establishing contact with a supernatural helper or teacher who will provide the individual with specific powers or knowledge needed for life. The vision quest is described in virtually every recorded indigenous tradition in North America, from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It appears in the ethnographic record with such consistency across cultural and geographic boundaries that many researchers consider it among the oldest documented spiritual practices in the world, possibly reaching back to the shamanic traditions of the Paleolithic era that are documented in the cave art of Europe. The connection between the vision quest tradition and the rock art of North America is direct and has been documented in many regional traditions. The images made in rock art contexts were frequently the visual records of vision experiences, made either by the individual who had the experience or by specialists who made images on behalf of others. The specific locations chosen for rock art were frequently places with strong spiritual associations, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the supernatural world was understood to be thin. These associations often derived from the character of the place itself: dramatic geology, unusual acoustic properties, the convergence of water and rock at a specific angle of light, the existence of cracks or openings in the rock face that might suggest portals to the underground world. The acoustic properties of rock art sites have been a subject of growing research interest in recent years. Researchers in France, Australia, and North America have documented a significant statistical correlation between the locations of major rock art panels and sites of particularly interesting acoustic phenomena, places where sound echoes dramatically, where the rock resonates at specific frequencies when struck, where a voice or a drum can produce unexpected amplifications or repetitions. The correlation suggests that the acoustic quality of a location was itself a factor in its selection as a site for supernatural communication and for the rock art that recorded or facilitated such communication. Places where the rock spoke back, might well have seemed like places where the supernatural world was especially present and accessible. In the Black Hills of South Dakota and Wyoming, in addition to the famous medicine wheel traditions, there is a rock art tradition associated with the Lakota and their predecessors, whose complexity and extent is only now being fully appreciated. The Black Hills themselves are a geological anomaly, an ancient granite uplift rising dramatically above the surrounding sedimentary plains, and they have been recognized as a sacred landscape by the peoples of the region for as far back as any oral tradition reaches. The spiritual geography of the Black Hills, the specific mountains, caves, springs, and rock formations that are connected to specific stories and powers in the Lakota and Cheyenne traditions, represents a detailed and comprehensive mapping of the supernatural onto the physical landscape that is not essentially different from the ceremonial landscape mapping visible in the effigy mound traditions of the Midwest or the astronomical alignments of the Southwest. Bear Butte, mentioned earlier, is the most publicly visible point of that sacred geography, but it is far from the only one. Inyan Kara Mountain, where Crazy Horse reportedly received visions, Medicine Mountain with its ancient wheel, Wind Cave, whose breath is understood as the sacred breath of the land itself, and which is one of the sites associated in Lakota oral tradition with the emergence of the people from the underground world at the beginning of time. Harney Peak, the highest point in the Black Hills, where Black Elk received his famous vision at the age of 9, a vision whose content he spent the rest of his life trying to understand and to act upon. The Black Hills are saturated with sacred meaning, and the oral traditions and ceremonial practices connected to specific places within them have been maintained continuously by the Lakota people, despite the loss of the hills to American treaty violation in the 1870s, a loss that remains one of the most contested legal and moral issues in the contemporary relationship between the United States government and the Lakota Nation. The Black Hills case illustrates a dimension of the American mysterious places story that is not abstract or historical, but immediately present and politically charged. The question of who has the right to access, manage, and make decisions about these places is not settled. In some cases, indigenous nations have regained control of their most sacred sites. In other cases, the sites remain under federal or state management that may or may not adequately incorporate the perspectives of the descendant communities. In still other cases, sacred sites are on private land with no legal protection, vulnerable to development or destruction. The legal and political battles over these places are ongoing, and the outcomes will determine what physical and social connections to the pre-Columbian past remain available to future generations. The question of sacred sites and their protection is not peripheral to the scientific understanding of mysterious places in America. It is central. The knowledge most needed to complete the reading of these sites is held by communities whose relationship to the sites is itself at stake in the political and legal battles over their management. When indigenous communities are excluded from decisions about sacred sites, or when those sites are damaged or destroyed before their full significance can be understood, the cost is not only cultural and spiritual, it is scientific. The irreplaceable knowledge that the sites encode and that the descendant communities have maintained is a resource for understanding human history that cannot be reconstructed once it is lost. The protection of sacred sites and the collaboration with the communities that hold knowledge about them are therefore not just matters of justice, though they are certainly that. They are matters of scientific urgency, because the discoveries still to be made at these places depend on the survival of both the physical sites and the knowledge traditions that give them meaning. The golden age of discovery that is underway will produce its most extraordinary results in the collaboration between the two, and what is found there will change the story of human civilization on this continent in ways that are only beginning to be imagined. What is beginning to be imagined, in the best of the current collaborative research, is something genuinely new in the history of American archaeology. A science of the pre-Columbian past that is built not only on the material record in the earth, but on the full range of human knowledge available about these places, from the ancient DNA in the bones to the stories in the mouths of elders, from the isotopic signatures in the pottery to the ceremonial songs that have encoded specific kinds of knowledge across generations, from the satellite imagery of buried features to the traditional ecological knowledge that explains what those features were for. This science is being built slowly, carefully, respectfully. It is being built in the face of significant institutional inertia and significant historical suspicion on the part of indigenous communities who have had little reason to trust academic institutions. It is being built in conditions of inadequate funding and inadequate time against the clock of ongoing development that destroys unexcavated sites faster than they can be investigated. But it is being built, and what it is finding at America's most mysterious places is, in the most literal and the most meaningful sense of the word, extraordinary. The Cahokia that is emerging from the latest research was not just the largest city north of Mexico in its time. It was a city with a cosmological vision, a city whose entire layout embodied a map of the universe as its inhabitants understood it, with the primary mound representing the central axis, connecting the underworld below to the sky world above, and the surrounding mounds and plazas representing the four cardinal directions and the specific powers associated with each. The people who built it and lived in it were not just building houses and growing corn, they were constructing and inhabiting a cosmic diagram, a material expression of their understanding of how the universe was organized and how the human community fit within it. The Chaco that is emerging from the latest research was not just a ceremonial center with astronomical alignments. It was a system of knowledge transmission, a place where the most precise measurements of solar and lunar cycles were maintained, and where the calendar that organized the agricultural and ceremonial life of communities across hundreds of miles was continuously updated and distributed. The roads that radiate from the canyon were not just transportation routes. They were channels for the movement of both people and information, the physical expression of a system of communication that allowed a continent-spanning knowledge tradition to function with the coherence and the precision that the astronomical alignments still demonstrate. The Newark earthworks that are emerging from the latest research were not just a geometric curiosity in an Ohio field. They were a ceremonial machine of extraordinary sophistication, a structure designed to make visible and experiential the relationship between the human community and the cycles of the moon over its full 18-and-a-half-year range, in a way that required the participation of many generations of builders and observers to complete, and that encoded in its geometry a cosmological model of the relationship between the human world and the sky world that was the deepest level of the Hopewell understanding of the universe. All of these places, and the dozens of others that have not been described in detail here, because a single treatment cannot do justice to all of them, are speaking. They have been speaking for a very long time, to anyone who knew the language. The language is becoming more widely known. The speakers of it are being listened to more than ever before. And what they are saying, in the particular dialect of this specific moment in the history of human self-understanding, is that the history of this continent is not what we were told it was. It is longer. It is richer. It is more connected, more sophisticated, more beautiful, and more directly relevant to the present moment than the narrative of a wilderness populated by simple peoples waiting for the arrival of civilization ever suggested. The civilizations were here. They built things of extraordinary ambition and precision. They understood the sky with a depth that took Western astronomy centuries to match. They organized social life on a continental scale without the tools that European civilization considered necessary for such organization. They managed landscapes of millions of acres, with a sophistication whose ecological results are now being recognized as models for sustainable land management. And they maintained the knowledge of all of this through catastrophe after catastrophe, through epidemics that killed 9 out of 10 of them, through dispossession and suppression and forced assimilation, through centuries of being told that they had no history worth knowing. They had history, they have history. And the scientists who are finding it at America's most mysterious places are finding, in the process, that the story of humanity on this continent is one of the great untold stories of the human species. Not the only great untold story. There are others in Africa and Asia and the Pacific that are equally in need of the kind of serious, respectful, well-funded, and collaborative attention that they deserve. But this one, this American story, is in a particular way the responsibility of everyone who lives in North America now, because it is the foundational history of the land beneath their feet, and because the people who are the living continuation of its ancient civilizations are their neighbors, and because the knowledge that those neighbors hold is needed, urgently, for the full understanding of what has been found in the most mysterious places of this remarkable continent. The sun moves, the stars turn, the earthworks hold their alignments, the mounds endure. The rock art waits on its canyon walls, patient in the way that only stone and pigment can be patient, for the moment when all of the people who live in and love this land are ready to read what was written there, in the deep time before history, by the ancestors of the first Americans. That moment is coming. The scientists can feel it. The indigenous knowledge holders can feel it. And on certain mornings, at certain sacred sites, when the light falls exactly as it was designed to fall 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, it is possible to feel it, even in the bones, that quiet certainty that the most important stories about where we came from and who we are and what this land has always been are still unfinished, still alive, still being told in the only language that lasts through all the centuries, the language of the earth itself, patient and precise, holding everything it has been asked to hold, waiting for us to come and listen. And that is where we will leave this journey tonight. Not at an ending, because this is not a story that ends, but at a moment of arrival, a landing point in a much longer voyage of understanding that is still underway, and that each new discovery extends a little further into the extraordinary depth of human time on this continent. The most mysterious places in America have not given up all their mysteries, but they have given up enough that the outlines of the full story are beginning to be visible, and what those outlines describe is a human achievement, an American achievement in the oldest sense of that word, that is worth everything we can bring to the task of understanding it. Sleep well. Dream of what was built here, and by whom, and with what knowledge, and toward what vision of the good and the possible. The dreams of the people who built these places are encoded in the stones and the earth and the painted canyon walls and the aligned doorways of this land. They are old dreams, they are strong dreams, and they are still dreaming. Somewhere beneath the surface of the story we have been told, waiting to be heard. There is one more thread to pull before the picture is as complete as any single telling can make it, and it runs through the very ground beneath the most ordinary-seeming American cities and towns. You do not have to go to Chaco or to the Black Hills or to the Ohio Valley to stand on ground that holds the record of thousands of years of continuous human presence. You can stand in downtown Street, Louis, a few blocks from the Gateway Arch, and be within walking distance of the largest pre-Columbian earthwork site in North America. You can drive through the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, and pass within miles of earthwork complexes that once covered an area larger than the entire city of ancient Rome. You can walk across a park in Savannah, Georgia, or a field in central Illinois, or a riverside floodplain in Tennessee, and be moving through spaces that were, at various points in the last 4,000 years, the centers of complex and populous societies whose names we do not know and whose stories we are only beginning to recover. The ordinariness of the American landscape that covers most of these sites is one of the most important facts about them. Not because the ordinariness diminishes them, but because it means that the recovery of the story they hold is not something that requires journeys to remote and dramatic places. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to look at the familiar landscape with the understanding that it is not what it appears to be, that the flat fields and the suburban developments and the river bottomlands that look empty of history are in fact saturated with it, layer upon layer of it, going back into depths of time that dwarf anything in the documented historical record. Every American who drives past a highway exit sign pointing toward an ancient mound site and does not take the exit is missing something that belongs to them, not as a matter of legal title, but as a matter of inheritance. This land's full history, the history that the science is now recovering and the indigenous communities have always held, belongs to everyone who lives here, and encountering it changes the way the landscape looks and the way the present moment feels. When you know that the field you are looking at was once a managed landscape, producing food for thousands of people, organized in a complex society, with astronomical knowledge and long-distance trade connections, the field does not look the same as it did before you knew. It becomes deeper. It becomes more inhabited by time. It becomes a place where the past is not gone, but only invisible, waiting for the attention that would make it present again. That attention is what the scientists are giving these places, and what the results of that attention are showing is extraordinary by any standard of human achievement. The ancient Americans who built the structures and managed the landscapes and maintained the knowledge traditions that these sites embody were not our inferiors. They were not primitive precursors of modern civilization, waiting for the superior culture that would eventually arrive to show them how things were done. They were our equals, and in many respects our superiors in the kinds of knowledge that their particular way of life required and developed. Their ecological science was more detailed and more empirically grounded than anything European natural history had produced by the time of contact. Their political institutions were, in some cases, more sophisticated solutions to the problems of organizing large-scale collective life than the institutions that European colonists brought with them. Their astronomical knowledge was precise enough to encode in stone and earth alignments that still work, 1,000 years later, to mark the passage of the sun and moon across the sky with fractions of a degree accuracy. None of this should shock anyone who has thought carefully about the human capacity for knowledge and achievement. All human populations have the same cognitive hardware. All human communities, given enough time in a landscape, develop detailed knowledge of that landscape and sophisticated social technologies for managing life within it. The particular forms that knowledge and sophistication take vary enormously, depending on the specific conditions and history of each community, but the capacity is universal. What is surprising is not that the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America were sophisticated. What is surprising is how thoroughly, and for how long, that sophistication was denied. The denial is ending. It is ending in scientific papers and museum exhibitions and documentary films and university curricula and legal proceedings and political speeches and the quiet, patient work of collaboration between indigenous knowledge holders and archaeological researchers. It is ending in the increasing sophistication of the public conversation about American prehistory, a conversation that is increasingly capable of holding complexity, of making room for a story that is genuinely extraordinary without reaching for supernatural explanations that would actually diminish it by suggesting that ordinary humans could not have done what the evidence shows they did. They did it. The people who aligned Pueblo Bonito to within fractions of a degree of true north, who engineered the Newark Octagon with lunar standstill precision, who moved tens of millions of cubic feet of earth to build Monk's Mound, who cut 500 miles of canals through the Arizona desert, with digging sticks and carrying baskets. They were people, human beings with the same range of intelligence and motivation and ambition that human beings have always had. They did what they did because they were smart, because they were organized, because they cared about the relationship between their communities and the sky and the earth and the generations that would come after them, and because they had the time and the knowledge and the social institutions to turn those concerns into action on the landscape. That is what the scientists are finding. Not mystery in the sense of inexplicability, not aliens, not lost races, not technologies from outside the human tradition. Just human beings, doing what human beings do when they have enough time and enough organization and enough knowledge and enough love for the world they inhabit. They transform it, they mark it, they align it with the sky. They inscribe it with meaning. They build in it the record of their understanding of how the universe works and what the human place within it requires. That record is here. It has always been here. And the scientists who are finding it, working alongside the communities who have never forgotten it, are giving us the most important gift that knowledge can give. A truer story of where we are and how we got here and who built the world that all of us, in ways we are still learning to see, are inheriting. The light over Fajada Butte is changing right now, in this moment, as it changes every day, moving through its annual cycle of alignments and illuminations. The sun and the moon are following the paths that the builders of Chaco tracked for generations before they encoded them in stone. The mounds of Ohio and Illinois and Alabama are holding their positions in the landscape, patient and enduring, waiting for more of the attention they deserve. And somewhere in a tribal office or a university archive or a kitchen table where an elder is talking to a grandchild, the knowledge that makes these places fully legible is being maintained, passed forward, kept alive for the moment when the wider world is finally ready to receive it. That moment is not in the future. It is now. It is happening in every paper published, every site protected, every collaboration begun, every story told. It is happening in the growing recognition that the most mysterious places in America are not mysteries at all, but records, and that reading them honestly and completely is one of the most important intellectual projects of this century. The reading is underway, the findings are extraordinary, and the world, when it is truly ready to hear what has been found, will be shocked. Not by the strangeness of it, but by the beauty. These places were built with intention, maintained with devotion, and encoded with knowledge deep enough to outlast the empires that tried to erase them. They are still here, and so are the people who remember what they mean. That conversation never stopped. It has only been waiting for more of us to join it.